is green. We want to showcase the policies and regulatory drive that will create the way to build our future. The investors will have the opportunity to appreciate the changing landscape in the financial sector and the commitment to sustainable growth that combines both financial and ESG considerations. There will be at the heart of the strategy, and we will build long-term values for our bank and stakeholders. To make our sustainability goal a reality, from ambition to action, it is not enough to do the work internally. We are building capacity, enhancing how to capture ESG factors for our customers, and rising to the reporting challenge that Bank Negara Malaysia has put forth through its climate change principle-based taxonomy guideline. We are assuring and managing our internal extensions while training our talent to enhance our sustainability. We need to communicate this and have a conversation with our investors as sustainable investing is shifting from shareholder to stakeholder capitalism and demands a new approach. Expectations on all sides are evolving. As a result, balancing ESG criteria with profitable investment strategies has become an urgent quandary. We must redesign the way that we communicate our sustainability approach, our roadmap to our stakeholders. We have imagined an inaugural virtual event for investors to tell our own ESG journey while creating a platform to bring together representatives and insights to help elevate key themes of the transition to a more sustainable financial future. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to note that we have also collaborated with Yayasan Hijau Malaysia in promoting and sustaining programs related to their national 100 million tree planting program. AmBank Group's sustainability journey continues here, and our pledge and commitment to achieve sustainable goals. The science and maths are clear. Planting trees is a useful tool that can be used to help mitigate the effects of climate change and protect the planet. The AmBank Group ESG Day, which is a collaboration between various units within the group, is a testament to the group's commitment in enhancing sustainability. I wish to reiterate our full support towards this program for the betterment of our community and convey my special thanks to everyone involved in organizing this event. With that, I wish everyone a very fruitful session. And again, thank you. Please stay safe.
Thank you, Chairman, for the insightful speech. We have a special announcement, an exciting collaboration to share with you. To announce this, I would like to invite Yang Berbahagia Dato Sulaiman, Group CEO, AmBank Group, onto our virtual stage. Dato?
Yeah, thank you, Zamima. Very good afternoon to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, my colleagues, to our very esteemed shareholders and investors who are here today. Before I start, I thought I want to give special thanks to the speakers today who are with us. We have, of course, AG Jessica, our regulator from BNM, and of course, Ms. Charlotte from Petronas, Dr. Dimitrious from Moody's, as well as Mr. John Leong from CBP. Thank you very much for being here today. And as mentioned by Zamima, in conjunction with this event, we are very proud to announce that we have established a collaboration with Yayasan Hijau to plant 100 million trees in Malaysia by 2025. And I'm happy to say and proud to announce that AmBank is the first financial institution to contribute towards these efforts. Ladies and gentlemen, as we all know today, the only commercially viable way of removing CO2, which is a large component of the GHG emissions out there from the environment, is by having more trees. So in this collaboration, we'll be planting 780 trees in Taman Eco Rimba Bukit Sungai Putih Ceras, somewhere in Wilayah Persekutuan. And why 780 trees, you may ask, is because we have 780 registrants. For this event, we have an ESG day today. In the morning, we had sessions with our customers. And of course, in the afternoon, we have sessions now, with you, our investors and shareholders. The plot is a 26 acres piece of forest reserve in this area. And clearly, this is a reforestation project. And the trees that we're planting will comprise of 772 camphor trees. I think, as you all know, in the Malay word for camphor trees, they are called kapo baros, 4 tampoy trees, as well as 4 rambai trees. And why we choose these trees? Because these are the trees that when they're big, they remove, a lot of carbon from the atmosphere. And based on the estimates by Yayasan Hijau, these 780 trees will remove close to 1,000 tons of CO2 per year. With Malaysia's individual carbon footprint at 8 tons per person per year, our trees will be able to support 125 individual Malaysians' carbon emissions per year. So there you go, ladies and gentlemen. The more people attend our session, the more we will plant trees. Last Saturday, on the 8th of January, we had planted 11 trees, and this was done by our staff. I thought I'll share with you the video as proof to the planting of the trees by our staff. So enjoy.
All of us recognize that the country and also the world is having a big challenge. Last 2 years, we had the COVID-19 pandemic, and at the end of last year, unfortunately, the country or many parts of the country was hit by floods. So these, to us, are actually calls for us to embrace sustainability in a serious fashion. These are painful reminders that we don't take care of the environment, then the environment will not take care of us.
So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for you helping us to plant those trees, by being here. At AmBank, we certainly hope to encourage more organizations to come forward and do the same. So together we can build a more sustainable and of course conscious world. And over the past year, the COVID-19 pandemic and the severe floods that we're seeing has affected the lives of many people and communities. And this is a clear message that we must do more. And we have a bigger role to play to mitigate the sustainability challenges. So today marks an important day as we launch our first ever ESG Day with you. So thank you for being with us. And I will now pass over the floor to our moderator, Ben McCarron. Ben, go ahead. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Ben, thank you, Dato, for that introduction to our planting a tree. Although we only planted a tree each, it was an indeed exhilarating experience and a meaningful one too, because of the math. We knew how much carbon we were absorbing, so it was really meaningful as well. So I'd like to introduce Ben. Ben will be our moderator for today. He's the founder and managing director, Asia Research and Engagement, ARE, based in Singapore. ARE collaborates with global institutional investors who raise ESG matters with Asian corporates. Thematic areas include energy transition and financing and sustainable protein. Ben, let me give you the reins and the floors to you for our virtual day. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Zamima, and thank you, Dato Sulaiman. Well, welcome everybody. It's both a privilege and a pleasure to be the moderator for today's event, AmBank's inaugural ESG Day. At ARE, we work with global institutional investors representing several $1 trillion in assets that are seeking to accelerate the energy transition across the region. And we hold dialogue with banks, with energy companies across Asia. We also produce research on key themes, and in fact, soon we will be publishing a report on the Asian banking sector and their response to climate change. And so I can certainly share the investors that we work with will be very pleased to see this kind of event happening, and also happening more frequently across the Asian region. And that's because the investors believe that a fast transition is important, and it will better support our prosperity, our collective prosperity in the future. And of course, for a fast transition, it really is critical that the finance sector plays a strong role. So there needs to be dialogue, but as the recent floods in Malaysia have just shown, there also needs to be action. In terms of the dialogue today, we're very fortunate to be joined by a distinguished group of speakers with a wide range of perspectives. We will hear first from Jessica Chu about how Bank Negara is seeking to foster a strong finance sector response to climate change risks and opportunities. Then we will hear international perspectives. So John Leong from CDP will talk about disclosure, the data and information challenge. And then Dr. Dimitrious Papanastasiou of Moody's Analytics will discuss the financial relevance of climate change and ESG in terms of performance. Then we'll return to Malaysia to hear from Charlotte Wolfeby of Petronas. That organization, that large business, of course, has a critical role to play in transitioning itself over time to ensure that the nation can also decarbonize. And finally, we'll hear from our hosts. Dato Sulaiman Tahir, Group CEO at AmBank, will share about the bank's ESG journey. For each session, we'll have a presentation and then a short question and answer session with myself. And at 5 p.m, we'll ask all of the speakers to reconvene to join a panel. And at that point, we will very much welcome questions from the audience. I should add there will be a coffee break at around 4 p.m. Just one thing to mention, unfortunately, Charlotte won't be able to join the later panel session, so we will open to audience Q&A after her talk. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Jessica from Bank Negara Malaysia and hear her thoughts on building the appropriate ecosystem.
Thank you very much, Ben. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today to share our response to climate change and its attendant risks in the financial sector. Let me first of all thank the AmBank Group for hosting this event and for the opportunity to share some reflections today. I should take this opportunity to mention that the AmBank Group is an active member of the Joint Committee on Climate Change, or JC3 as we know it here, and actively supports the committee's work on several fronts, in particular in the area of capacity building. The AmBank Group is also an active contributor to the value-based intermediation, or VBI community of practice, that also, as some of you would know, plays a key role in driving value-based intermediation practices in the financial sector here in Malaysia. So let me take this opportunity to acknowledge the substantive contributions of the group in supporting efforts to advance the sustainable finance agenda. Today, I thought I'd focus my remarks on 4 areas: the strategic priorities of Bank Negara Malaysia in tackling the climate challenge, our approach to working with the financial sector to address climate risks and support transition, the basic construct. I'll say a little bit about the basic construct of the climate change principle-based taxonomy, which to us is a key building block that we're putting in place to support climate risk assessments and disclosures. And I'll close off with a bit on what we're seeing across the financial sector in terms of commitments and solutioning to support the transition to a low-carbon economy. Can I have the next slide, please? Malaysia has expressed its commitment to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 and has also increased its ambition recently to reduce greenhouse gas emissions intensity by 45% by 2030 compared to 2005 levels under the Paris Agreement. Now, in line with these commitments, the government continues to prioritize the pursuit of green growth and has announced specific strategies and plans to that end, which can be found in the 12th Malaysia Plan. For the financial sector, the significant and far-reaching implications of climate change, including the government's national response to reduce emissions, is a critical issue for Bank Negara Malaysia from several perspectives. First and foremost, as the Financial Stability Authority, we are primarily concerned with ensuring that climate risks, both physical and transition risks, are effectively identified and managed by financial institutions. This includes the need to strengthen the capabilities within financial institutions to manage climate-related risks. We also recognize that the financial sector has a central role in supporting the broader national strategy to tackle climate change, given the significant financial resources needed for mitigation and adaptation activities. It has been estimated that investments of between 350 to 450 billion ringgit will be needed to achieve net zero ambitions by 2050. This needs to be taken into account in how we at the bank manage the financial sector's response to climate risk. So ensuring a coherent regulatory policy framework is an important part of our strategy to create an enabling environment for the mainstreaming of green finance and investments. For example, we are looking at ways to better align the large exposure limits, our single customer exposure limits, with strategies in which financial institutions finance transition activities that are executed along a supply chain with economic interdependencies. Secondly, in the same way that we express expectations of financial institutions to embed climate risk considerations in their risk assessments, we are similarly at the bank focused on strengthening our own capacity to account for climate risks in our macroeconomic and financial stability assessments as a central bank and a financial stability authority. And finally, we believe in leading by example through actions to reduce our carbon footprint in our own operations. These considerations effectively inform the 5 key thrusts of our climate strategy as shown in this slide. Next slide, please. Our approach to the management of climate-related risks in the financial sector is a collaborative one. Now, this has served us particularly well given the high level of uncertainty associated with climate-related risks. Climate risk management practices among financial institutions in Malaysia are also at a relatively early stage of development. So while we do expect climate risk to be managed in an integrated manner with other financial risks, what that looks like in practice is in an institution and across the industry is very much still evolving. So reflecting this approach, one of the first steps we took in 2018 was to establish the Joint Committee on Climate Change with the Securities Commission and industry practitioners. When it started, its initial objectives were simply to provide a platform for dialogue and knowledge sharing. Since then, just in under about 3 years or so, the JC3 has rapidly evolved to become a key forum for advancing concrete, collective climate actions in the financial sector. Today, the JC3 supports and drives a hefty work program that focuses on 5 areas: risk management, governance and disclosures, green finance and innovation, data, and capacity building. Over the last 3 years, JC3 has supported the co-creation of practical tools and guidance for the industry to support climate risk management and disclosures. It has organized targeted outreach and engagements with the business community to gather insights that have been used to inform green finance policies and solutions. It has developed technical programs for the financial industry workforce, and crucially, it is coordinating a significant cross-sector interagency effort to identify and address key data needs to support climate risk management, solutioning, and stress testing, among other use cases. Next slide, please. One of the key deliverables supported by the JC3 has been the development of a climate change and principle-based taxonomy. This was issued in April last year for the classification of economic activities and exposures by banks, insurance companies, takaful operators, and development financial institutions in Malaysia. The taxonomy represents a key building block in supporting climate risk assessments and disclosures by financial institutions. Under the CCPT, economic activities are classified as either climate supporting, climate transitioning, or watch list activities as shown here. Now, there are 2 things that I would like to highlight about the taxonomy. First, the classifications are guided by defined principles that consider both the direct impacts of a funded activity on climate change mitigation and adaptation, as well as the impact of the activity and the entity's overall operations on the broader environment. For example, how the business operations affect pollution, biodiversity, and resource efficiency. The second point is that the classification is not a binary one, and this is to reflect the diversity of activities that are currently at different stages of transitioning. And importantly, for us, it is to signal expectations for financial institutions to support an orderly transition by working with their customers to recognize and reinforce concrete efforts that they are taking to move towards sustainable practices. This is also critical to minimize economic dislocations that would increase macroeconomic and financial stability risks in the short run. I would also note that these classifications are clearly distinguished, as you can see here, within the taxonomy to address greenwashing. Next slide, please. At the regional level, the ASEAN community, via the ASEAN Taxonomy Board, has recently released the conceptual framework of the ASEAN Taxonomy for Sustainable Finance for public consultation. The ASEAN Taxonomy will serve to reduce fragmentation and promote alignment across national taxonomies in the region. As an early mover, we have been able to work successfully with our ASEAN partners to develop a foundation framework for the ASEAN taxonomy that is aligned with the climate change principle-based taxonomy. Sector-specific metrics and thresholds will be further developed in the next phase of the ASEAN taxonomy, also referred to as the Plus Standard Framework. The 2-tiered framework aims to support ASEAN economies in different stages of economic development and in the climate journey, while encouraging sustained progress towards more evidence-based classification systems. In Malaysia, the CCPT is also complemented by the Value-Based Intermediation Assessment Framework sectoral guides that provide more detailed guidance on sector or activity level assessments on environmental, social, and governance impacts. So far, 6 sectoral guides have already been issued. The financial sector has made encouraging progress, especially in recent years. We see climate initiatives being integrated into business strategies and operations. An increasing number of financial institutions have pledged long-term commitments, including commitments to achieve carbon neutral and net zero GHG emissions by 2030 and 2050 respectively, and phasing out coal from their financing portfolio. More financial institutions are also offering green financial products and solutions as illustrated on this slide. To support the transition of SMEs, Bank Negara has established a matching 1 billion ringgit fund named the Low Carbon Transition Facility to help SMEs embrace sustainable and low carbon practices in their operations. This includes activities that they may undertake to increase the use of sustainably produced raw materials and renewable energy, and efforts to improve the energy efficiency of buildings and machinery. In closing, let me recap on the next slide just some of the upcoming signposts in our climate journey that will serve to progressively strengthen our foundations for managing climate-related risks in the financial sector and encourage financial flows towards supporting our transition to a low-carbon economy. Starting from July this year, financial institutions regulated by Bank Negara Malaysia will begin regular reporting of their climate risk-related exposures against the climate change principle-based taxonomy to Bank Negara. This will inform risk assessments and support our supervisory engagements with financial institutions on their management of climate-related risks. In our recently issued exposure draft on climate risk management and scenario analysis, we have also expressed expectations for financial institutions to set and monitor internal climate-related targets by December 2023, consistent with how they have considered climate-related risks in their business and risk strategies. By December 2024, we will require financial institutions regulated by Bank Negara to publish climate risk-related financial disclosures that are aligned with the TCFD recommendations. And we have commenced work to lay the groundwork for the conduct of industry-wide climate change stress tests that will be organized in 2024. So Ben, let me stop here and I'm happy to take any questions.
Jessica, thanks ever so much for that comprehensive overview, and particularly for setting out the timeline that's expected over the next few years. One item that we know is going to be required is the new financial products that will enable us and the system to direct capital to new and growing opportunities. And of course, that also means structuring different kinds of products. One question that we know will be relevant to some of the business development teams is, will there be a different route for approvals for new products? And if so, how would that be implemented?
Thank you, Ben, for that question. It's a very practical one. We do have a framework where financial institutions do submit new to market products to the bank for review and approval. We don't currently contemplate any changes to that process, that regulatory process currently. But having said that, I will make probably 2 points. One is internally within the bank, we have established a sustainability unit that coordinates the work across departments in the bank around sustainability issues. And that will include our regulatory response to things like new product applications. So we have organized ourselves to ensure that there will be that careful consideration of our priorities and objectives. and alignment with our financial sector expected outcomes when we look at these products. So the industry can expect a streamlined and efficient process at our end in terms of engagements with institutions on applications. The second point I will make is that we have been facilitative in recent periods, and you can see this in the space of Islamic finance in particular, of initiatives by the industry to pilot, new product innovations. And this kind of takes like a sandbox experimental, we allow flexibility and, on a smaller scale basis to roll out products, and that allows us the opportunity to observe risks and issues, usually conduct issues as well, that need to be taken into account. So with both those arrangements in place, we believe that, that approval process should be something that will be very much facilitative of initiatives by the industry to introduce new green products.
That flexibility will certainly be an aid to innovation, I'm sure. I guess sort of zooming out a bit to a slightly broader question, the financial system itself isn't, of course, sort of perfectly linked into the real economy. They do obviously send signals in each direction, but they're not perfectly coherent. So how can we sort of take the learnings of what we see from a risk or opportunity perspective, particularly in different sectors, from the finance system and think about sort of what happens more broadly in the real economy? How can that sort of signaling mechanism work?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the areas that we, one of the first things that we wanted to do with JC3 was create the ability for us to connect with stakeholders outside of the financial sector, and to do it in a way that is systematic, that is not fragmented, not ad hoc, but thoughtful and coordinated. So one of the subcommittees under the JC3 is focused specifically on engagement and capacity building. So the engagement piece is really what I think you're referring to, the ability to take what is happening within the financial industry. And over the last few years, the financial industry has made some very significant strides in terms of the sustainability agenda and on climate change specifically. So making sure a number of objectives of that engagement with external stakeholders, and I would mention in particular, obviously, the government ministries and agencies, as well as research houses and the investor community as well. One of the key things that we wanted to ensure was alignment, that our financial sector response to climate risk and the things that we're focused on, the priorities that we're pushing and driving, are aligned with at least whatever we're able to see in terms of the government's direction forward. And there is also increasing clarity on the government's direction forward with the announcement of the net zero ambitions and the national adaptation policies also that are being rolled out. So that's really where the nexus that we believe will continue to leverage extensively on the links that we're creating through JC3 to ensure alignment. And I think that feedback loop works both ways as well. So one of the things that JC3 will be putting out in the coming year is a report that will bring together observations from its engagements to shine a light on the key challenges and priorities of businesses with respect to their transition journey, and at the same time also bring to the surface the financial solutions that are available across the industry for businesses to tap into.
Thank you for that, and it is great to hear about the links between both finance and the broader planning functions of the economy. It's certainly something that I've observed in the years I've been covering Malaysia, that we need more climate research in a sense to set out those pathways. So one question that does come up, particularly for the finance industry, but for businesses more broadly, is the concern of reputation risks and greenwashing. And how can, it's a market-wide concern as well as an institution-by-institution concern. So how to ensure that the industry can overcome that risk?
Yeah, that's a great question and clearly a concern for us as well. So when we developed the taxonomy, it is a principle-based taxonomy, and we were very mindful that while we wanted it to be principle-based because that supports that graduation of the different categories, different classification categories. At the same time, it was very important to us to ensure that it was credible, and so how we are attempting or striving to manage or mitigate the risk of greenwashing. A couple of things. One is the taxonomy is complemented by use cases, and we will continue to develop more and more use cases to support the interpretation, the classification, and to make sure that those classifications are robust and credible. The second thing would be, this is an evolving, again, I mentioned earlier that this is very much the collaborative approach we've taken reflects our acknowledgement that this is an evolving area. We're all learning. So, for us, our supervisory engagements will be the other source through which we will look at how financial institutions are classifying economic activities, and we'll draw out over time, practices that we believe actually, are bordering on greenwashing, and practices, the good practices. And I think this will be the way in which that we will work very hard to address the impact of or the risk of greenwashing. The other piece that I would add is the value-based intermediation assessment framework that also has extensive and more detailed guidance at the sector and activity levels that also contribute and provide inputs to guide financial institutions in the classification of activities. So those are some of the things that we will continue to use to manage this risk.
Thank you very much for sharing on that. And there's one other sort of major pillar that we haven't touched on quite yet, but we certainly will be in some of the upcoming sessions. This question of data availability or information availability, and sort of many leaders say, well, it's quite hard for me to make business decisions and adjust strategy. I don't have the basic information in place to support those kinds of decisions. But I understand that that there's an intent, JC3 is intending to address that. I wonder if you could share more.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned that and this was a very recent subcommittee established by the JC3. It's focused, exclusively on addressing the data gaps. Obviously data is critical for a number of different use cases, and what the committee has done is identify through extensive engagements over the past year with industry and other stakeholders, including the investment community, to look at what are the most important use cases. And they came up with 7. So climate-related disclosures was clearly one key, and common use case. Exposure quantification, so we need data to quantify exposures. Financial stability monitoring, coming from the central bank, that clearly that is something that we look to close data gaps around. Investment and lending decisions. We need data to also support macroeconomic modeling for product development and solutioning. And finally, the last use case that came up was clearly data needed for scenario analysis and stress testing. So, with the use cases that were identified, the group actually went down to look at, okay, what are the data needs to support these use cases, the most critical data needs that will support these use cases. And then on the supply side, the group is going to look at, well, where can we source this data? Is it available somewhere? And very often it will be available, it could be available, but it might be available in raw form and not in the in a usable format. So there's also the bit about making sure that the data can be transposed into forms that can be used for the various use cases. So what will happen hopefully this year is there will be a repository of sorts of data needs and sources of data. And the next phase of the work will be looking at how we, some specific recommendations and action plans to bridge those data gaps where there are needs, but data is not available, or data is available, but not in the form that is usable. So that's broadly the plan for this group. It's intensive. They've got a lot on their plate and a lot of work laid out for them. But, critical to our climate journey.
That's something that's come up in quite a few of our discussions with different banks across the region, and it really can depend on what's available in the local market, but particularly something like physical risks. Sort of how granular is the flood risk data, and what one side of the road can be different from another side of the road. It can get that specific. So talking sort of kind of from data into disclosure, you touched on TCFD as part of the roadmap, and I wonder if you can elaborate a little more on that, and particularly if it's been localized in any way to suit Malaysian financial institutions, or whether it's very much plug and play from the global recommendations and prescriptions.
It's largely plug and play from the recommendations as well as observations. What JC3 has done is to develop application guides to help institutions apply the recommendations of the TCFD by referring to range of disclosure practices across corporations globally, good practices. So that will be helpful, hopefully, to financial institutions. The other area in which that particular initiative has been localized was also to kind of point to specific data needs that might need to be addressed in order to support disclosures in line with TCFD, and that will be very much viewed from a local context. So the timeline that we have set out for financial institutions that we regulate is to mandate publication of disclosures that are consistent with TCFD by 31st December of 2024. And that kind of very much dovetails with our implementation timeline for the risk management guideline that I alluded to earlier, that we just published for consultation. So there are various pieces in that reference guide that is very much written in a way that is sort of mapped almost to the TCFD. So as institutions work through putting in place those different pieces, by the 31st December 2024, we believe that they will be in a good position to make disclosures, high quality disclosures that are consistent with TCFD.
Okay, thank you very much. So there's a little bit of a run-in, but there's also, you've been warned. Coming sort of final question, perhaps on the support and incentive side, to what extent can JC3 and financial regulators support financial institutions where we're thinking about broad-based sustainable solutions for their clients? So there's sometimes what can happen is that when you sort of do all of the work and diligence to find sustainable economic activities or sustainable financial products, unfortunately, all of that work can represent a cost and drive up the costs of what was supposed to be low-cost financing. So I wonder whether, and that's particularly a challenge in SME and retail markets, actually. I wonder if you can share on how you're looking to support and incentivize activity, notwithstanding some of those potential costs.
Yeah. Well, let me one thing that we will do, I've already mentioned, is we're trying to kind of surface the key needs of businesses and provide visibility for the financial industry into that, so that the solutioning can also take place. The second thing I have also already mentioned is that we are providing funds, particularly for SMEs. We do provide funds. Bank Negara provides funds to financial institutions on lend to SMEs. And one of the funds that was recently announced was the low carbon transition facility. So it's a matching fund. So for every ringgit that we provide low cost financing to the financial institutions, they would top that up with a matching amount and extend that to SMEs for transitioning activities. So that's another way in which we're supporting the industry in this. On the regulatory incentives, it's probably still early days for us. It's certainly something that we are looking at the bank, but not any concrete plans around this are I believe that there are still early days. There are two ways to look at the regulatory framework. One is from the the punitive aspect of it. So certainly from a risk perspective, I mean, we will be looking at the build-up of concentrations to climate risk exposures and considering what are some of the ways that we can mitigate that and incentivize financial institutions to manage that risk level down and support transitioning. The other, of course, is the incentives, and I think this is also, I mentioned that we are definitely looking as a first priority. We're looking to align all the different to make sure the policies are coherent. I mentioned the single customer exposure limit, making sure that that isn't standing in the way of efforts by financial institutions to support transition finance across a supply chain, for example. Because because of the economic interdependencies, they tend to be aggregated and that can breach the limits. So we're looking at making these adjustments as a first step to make sure that the regulatory framework is coherent. The next step will be looking at areas in which there may be a possibility of, and this will be something that we will continue to engage with the industry on where are some of the most important barriers, if to put it that way, in terms of the ability of institutions to roll out broader finance solutions for transition.
Jessica, thank you very much. So something very concrete there, and a little bit more consideration. Just remains to say thank you for your sharing and illuminating so much of the path forward, and also to Bank Negara more broadly for taking a lead on these issues. And thank you as well for agreeing to come back at 5 p.m. Today for the session then. So for everyone in the audience with specific questions, Jessica has kindly agreed to come back later, and we'll be very happy to take questions there.
Thank you.
Thank you. So now we're going to take a bit of a switch and shift from sort of local regulatory context and draw on at least one of the themes that was mentioned in that session, being data and disclosure. We're fortunate to be joined by Mr. Leong, the Director, Southeast Asia and Oceania of CDP. And he's based in Singapore, has had 25 years of experience in general management, business development, marketing, and corporate development in the UK and Asia, before stepping across to join and take a role just quite recently, actually, at CDP. So, John, if I can hand the floor over to you to give a different perspective.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can hear me. Thank you, Dato Zamima and Dato Sulaiman and Jessica for a fine presentation there from Bank Negara, which are some great points that I hope to pick up on and highlight as well in how we're all linked in this ecosystem. As Ben mentioned, I'm very new to the organisation. This is my fourth week and my first public appearance. So very honoured to be part of the AmBank Group ESG Day. So thank you very much for the invite. It's great to be here. I come from a enterprise commercial background, and but this subject of climate change has been on my radar for a number of years. So it's a privilege to be able to share my conviction and move across to CDP, which is an NGO. And we've been involved in climate disclosure for over 20 years, and through companies disclosing to us, city-states and regions on a global basis. And that evolved from our base in London, but more and North America. And more recently, we are focused very much on Asia Pacific, including a new office in Singapore to cover the Southeast Asia region. So how do we operate? How do we work? Let me just go to the next slide, please. Okay, slightly complex slide, but this hopefully gives you the architecture of how we are involved in disclosure and how it impacts what we do to drive to net zero. So financial institutions on the left, you see here, purchasing companies, investors, they disclose, and they actually often request companies to disclose. They request their supply chain to disclose to CDP. And it's a very, very detailed questionnaire of, I think, about nearly 300 questions. And with that disclosure, we are able to track and measure and help improve impact and performance across climate, but also water and forestation. Samples of the disclosure are available on our website. So it's, as an NGO, we're very public on that and on the data. And through that data, we rate companies from A downwards. And the rating systems are not to be too fixated on, but basically they give an idea of where the company is on its path to net zero, from disclosure to awareness to management and then to leadership. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we have great influence given the history, and a lot of people buy or use our data. We are also part of the SBTI, one of the 4 founding members. And as you can see here, FTSE, MSCI, Goldman Sachs, to name a few, use our data when it comes to ESG reporting, particularly around, obviously, the E, where we focus on the environment. And that's just to give you an idea of the scope and coverage of what we cover. Next slide, please. So what does that look like in terms of data? We love data in this organization. We have 600 plus investors and financial institutions, which has 110, covers 110 million assets. There are over 200. Sorry, someone's not on mute here. I can hear some interference. Okay. There are over 200 supply chain members and a huge 5.5 trillion purchasing power. Last year, 13,000 companies responded through CDP. It's a massive increase from the, I think, 8,000 that we had. So everything's going in the right direction. Obviously, a big spotlight for this year post COP26. So we expect to see a further increase in disclosure in 2022, and an increase, obviously, in global market capitalization. So CDP data is powering the new financial products, such as New York State's Commons Retirement Fund, low carbon index, as an example. And on top of that, we have cities, over 1,000 cities in the world disclose their environmental information and how they're driving towards net zero. Great. Okay, next slide. So a little bit on Asia Pacific here. Nearly 4,000 companies in 2021 disclosed. And as you can see, the majority are in China and Japan, and historically that's driven by supply chain requests. For instance, Walmart Foundation will request all their supply chain companies to disclose. So that obviously drives the number up greatly in China. But I obviously would like to point out how well Malaysia is doing in its past year. We're up 29% year on year for APAC, which is great. But as you can see here, in Malaysia, we've increased 83% from 41 to 75 responding companies. 15 responded to investors, financial institutions, and 60 responded to customers and supply chain program. So companies like Top Glove, ACGA, Digi. We also have AmBank as well as disclosure. And significantly, Tenaga has voluntarily disclosed, and that's great because they're looking to get to net zero by 2050. And in disclosing, they now have a framework and a plan to significantly reduce by 2025. Next slide, please. So some of the key analysis from our disclosure and what that data means. First point is governance. So in our analysis, we can see we have high level board oversight, which is great. That's where it starts from top down. We also like to think it can start from bottom up as well, but importantly in large corporate institutions that we cover, it's got to be board level, top down. But where the improvement is needed is in the action, and how that drives oversight. And as you can see, the percentages drop when you look at the impact of financing portfolio. So this is the change that we're trying to impart. Next slide, please. And in terms of sort of your portfolio alignment, you can see here the breakdown. This is a global breakdown, by the way. I don't have Southeast Asia at the moment, but something we'll be working on for this year to get more granular and then by country level. But as you can see here, broken down into banks, asset owners, asset managers, and insurance companies, there are steps, and this is an increasing figure, which is great to see, where there are plans to take the portfolio to a below 2 degree world. Actually, now we're looking at 1.5 as the target. Next slide. So with this data and what you can see, next slide, please. There are opportunities and obviously risks. And some of the key risks, if things do not change and if action is not taken, we have now analysed as a huge credit risk, as you can see the first bar on the top slide. And that's particularly for banks. Tracks are over 50%. And second to that, apart from operational risk, is really the reputational risk. And this is not even taking into account climate risk. So this is what our data shows, but it also shows the kind of impact that you may have. And if I move on to the next slide, we'll be able to talk about the opportunities. So why disclose? Why move to net zero? There are great opportunities for the banking sector, for financial institutions, to overcome their potential credit risk and reputational risk. And whilst the impact is great, or could be great, and over 500 billion in US dollars, the opportunity exists in trillions of dollars in terms of new products and services and markets. And this is 2020 data. Actually, this number is only going to increase in terms of opportunities when it comes around to sustainable finance for 2021. And I look forward to sharing that with you in due course. So how to exploit those opportunities? Next slide, please. So approaching those opportunities, we are looking really at engagement and divestment, and they are not mutually exclusive at all. It's kind of like yin and yang, really. You can't do one without the other. And although we are focused on climate change in this particular webinar, it does have effects on other environmental risks too, in terms of forestation and water security. But really, it's all about engaging with clients and helping set a pathway to sustainable operations. So as a financial institution, you're not just looking inwardly about how you get to net zero. You have to look at your investment, your products, and how the companies that you're making those investments in, or working with or collaborating in, are they on a sustainable pathway in their operations? And that goes all the way down to SMEs, as Jessica mentioned as well, which is a separate topic, but something that's going to be very important going forward. And also divestment in the context of withdrawal of loans or support or unsustainable activities, de-incentivization or incentivization for those companies that are sustainable. Okay, so next slide. I'm just going to go through some case studies now of some of the actions that are taking place in this region. So here we have AmBank and their commitment of allocating 50 billion. So AmBank's been disclosing since 2010, which has been very positive. Their score is a little bit flatlining at the moment, but their program and commitments are obviously here for everybody to see. And the board is, as you can see, the quote from Dato Mohammed is very much on par with what we're trying to achieve. To be the force of good, we must broaden our sustainability knowledge through working with multiple partners. I will share these slides, so we won't read these case studies out, but just to give you a top line of what's going on. Next slide, please. Here we have a case study with UOB and Wilmar, and UOB extending $200 million in the sustainability linked loan to Wilmar. And this is critical because when we realize that our population now is over 7 billion, you look at the third point along the line, how we're going to sustain the production of food and agriculture when our population is going to be close to 10 billion, by 2050. So another positive quote here from UOB. Next slide, please. And we mentioned about loans. So here are a couple of examples of CIMB getting involved with StarHub in terms of sustainable loans to increase transparency. StarHub will be eligible for interest savings if it achieves its pre-annual targets. And then Sumitomo Bank working with the sports brand ASICS in the supplier engagement rating. So this is a sub-scored part of our questionnaire. And if ASICS fails to hit the required score, which is A, the top score, by 2023, it must make a donation to a specified NGO. So these are types of ways you can see and examples of how investors and financial institutions are driving towards net zero with incentives. Next slide. So financing program here. We mentioned Walmart and supply chain. Walmart Foundation and Walmart itself is a huge client of CDP, and here we can see just a sort of flow chart of how it works. One of the biggest retailers in the US, huge supply chain that is actually majority sourced by out in China, and how it is funded by their bank is HSBC. Now, supply chain in this part of the world, especially Malaysia, is critical as I live across the border from Johor Bahru, and the OEMs, the number of OEMs there, and the significance of those OEMs to companies like Dyson and global manufacturers around the world, producing all manner of products. And so driving towards what Jessica said, towards the mandatory disclosure by 2024, it's important to develop the right kind of framework. And within CDP, our framework, our overall framework questionnaire is based on TCFD, or is TCFD aligned and built in, and also it's SBTI as being a founding member is built in. So companies disclose because in a few years' time you're going to be regulated to disclose. So you want to get on a path and journey early enough to analyze and be aware of where you are as an organization, so you can then, with that data, drive to net zero. Because if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. There's always been the motto within CDP. So I'd just like to finish my last slide on a quote from, second to last slide on a quote from Schroders. The argument that climate change can affect value and that something must be done about it is broadly accepted, and that's been broadly accepted probably for the last 15 to 20 years, since Paris Agreement and COP26 now. But CDP data provides the bridge that enables investors to get there, to actually doing something about it. Now, that's a nice quote, but what does that mean? So my final slide will hopefully demonstrate what that means. So next slide, please. Can we get to the next slide? Thank you. So, no, that's one ahead. Go back one. Thank you. So, working with stocks, we actually, who are global climate change leaders, the index, with our A list of companies, the companies that scored A and our leaders in driving environmental change, they actually outperformed the Stocks Global 1800 index by actually, it's over 5%. So around about 5.3%, as you can see here. So there is no reason not to get on board, to start disclosing, to drive change and reap the benefits in terms of improved performance. And thank you very much. That is the end of my presentation, and I'm available to be reached on this email, and happy to take questions now. Ben.
John, thank you very much for the exposition of CDP. I just wanted to clarify a couple of points about the process of the tools. So there's two tools,
Yes.
CDP itself for investors, and then there's the CDP supply chain for the companies. Is that the current main tools?
Well, it's one questionnaire, and normally investors and companies, pension funds, if you like, that have a strong ESG focus and mandate will often request the companies that they invest in to disclose themselves and to have their supply chain disclose. So within the questionnaire, there are specific questions targeted to supply chain members or supply chain companies.
And also, is it true that some of the large corporates are particularly using CDP as a sort of a way of ensuring sustainability and sustainable resilience through their supply chain?
Absolutely. I mean, CDP, with its long history, is kind of the gold standard, if you like. And because we've built in TCFD and SBTI within our questionnaire, then it provides a kind of master framework for companies to develop a sustainable plan. We've been a member of, obviously, a founding member of SBTI since 2015, and since then we've obviously incorporated that into the program.
And so I think the implication then, and the story about Johor, the risk is, if you're one of those companies in Johor, then in that global supply chain, if you're not sort of moving on this, then at some point you could get left behind. Is that the message?
Pretty much, yeah. Not just in supply chain and OEMs. I just thought I'd highlight that and as an obvious example, and as a strength of Malaysia in its manufacturing capabilities. But really, it goes across all companies, all products and suppliers, and many verticals. I was at an event last night, and an IT company anecdotally mentioned how when they went to procurement to pitch for part of the RFP to pitch for the business, the procurement of the bank asked if they'd adopted SBTI or SBT initiatives within the IT company. So it can be on many levels, not just product and manufacturing, but on service as well. So it's becoming part of the mandate in all procurement circles. So what we profess is to get on board, to actively disclose, and get on the journey, because to not be left behind, but when it's mandated by regulation. Absolutely.
And you've mentioned SBTI a couple of times, and there's also been this discussion about TCFD. Could you just share a little bit about what those are and how CDP interacts with them?
Yeah, so one of the main reasons why CDP data is widely used and part of the ESG community and financial sector is due to the alignment and recommendations for the task force on, or TCFD, the task force on climate-related financial disclosures. It means CDP can provide a roadmap for companies looking to disclose on environmental issues. The TCFD provides recommendations, guidelines. You've got to remember, as a CDP, we're an NGO, we're non-advisory, so we provide a platform that produces the data. So TCFD provides the recommendations and the guidelines of what investors and companies should look to be evaluating, and then CDP questions break down those guidelines into actionable metrics for companies. We also provide guidance and resources and support to companies on their environmental journey. And companies are scored because you have to have some sort of measure, and the scoring methodology is actually independent. We don't do that ourselves. but it's standardized and it provides investors with a standardized comparable framework and benchmark to look at their portfolios to look at companies in their portfolios, should I say. With SBTI, as I mentioned, we work with the 4 founding members, WRI, the UN, and WWF. And as a founding member, this is really we have about over 2,000 companies now that have joined the specific SBTI program, almost 500 in APAC, and this is basically to provide a more science-based, as the name suggests, framework to achieving net zero or 1.5 degree pathway. So that answers your question.
Right. So just to clarify, the CDP is the data, TCFD is sort of the disclosure set into the public domain, and then SBTI is how one should think about target setting to make sure the one's aligned with the climate agenda.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, all the data, all the questionnaire and everything is publicly available on the cdp.net website.
Okay, so there's a 300 question list. One of the top questions, governance, I think I captured there is board level responsibility for climate change and that top down aspect, and 96% I think you said of the global set has that particular point, so that might be
should be 100% really, but 96% are aware, so it is somewhere on the agenda. How high up it is on the agenda and how that translates down into action, as you can see the reducing percentages. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed, John, and John's also kindly agreed to come back at 5 and answer audience questions. But for now, just thanks very much for that sharing, and congratulations on the new role with CDP.
Thank you. Exciting times. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you. So we turn now to essentially another international perspective. We're very fortunate to be joined by Dr. Dimitrious Papanastasiou, who's a director from Moody's Analytics, EMEA, and he's the head of the industry practice lead group for Moody's across Asia and the Middle East. His role covers all aspects of risk and analytics, stress testing, IFRS 9 compliance, and ESG and climate risk quantification, so just a subset, and that's for financial institutions and corporates. And before this, he held the risk, he led the risk analytics team at the UK's Prudential Regulation Authority in London. So Dr. Dimitrious is the sort of academic, regulatory, and now advisory with tools perspectives that we will have here. Over to you, Dimitrious.
Thank you very much, Ben. Just for me to be aware of how much time do we have for this section? Is it 30 minutes overall?
But let's maximum.
Yeah. Okay.
We're slightly over, but I think we're a little less over than we were earlier. Okay,
cool. Yeah. Thank you very much to AmBank for inviting us today, and a very good afternoon to everyone. For us, it was a very good opportunity to share some insights, I would say, and some of our experiences working with financial institutions in the wider Southeast Asia region. And at the same time, maybe discuss some of our approaches and methodologies when it comes to either assessing ESG and climate risk on a standalone basis, or how to actually quantify the financial impact from ESG and climate risk. So in the context of the previous two presentations, I would probably say that I sit somewhere in the middle, right? I'm not going to talk too much about disclosures per se, but essentially how to use the disclosures, how to translate the information from the disclosures into ESG and climate risk metrics, and also what those metrics means for financial kind of impact, primarily on the credit side, right? Because when people kind of hear the name Moody's, typically they associate us with credit risk. Now, one thing that's it's mandatory for us to make it clear up front is that we are not here representing the rating agency side of Moody's. Now, the Moody's Corporation, many of you will be aware of the rating agency side of our business, which is, I would say, our bread and butter. So that's on the far left of this particular slide, where you have pretty much all the analysts that do the credit assessment for publicly traded debt. We sit actually in the middle box, Moody's Analytics, and our remit is to provide risk management solutions to our clients. Now, those risk management solutions might well be the output of the work from the rating agency, right? But at the same time, we are combining capabilities that we have across the different parts of the company to provide something a bit more holistic, sometimes even using our own quantitative models within the Moody's Analytics umbrella. Now, as you can see from this slide, we do have also an independent ESG unit across Moody's Corporation that I would say sits across the rating agency and us on the Moody's Analytics side. And their remit is to provide ESG type of research and ESG assessment for companies. And the output of their work is actually to be used by the analysts on the rating side of Moody's, and also us on the Moody's Analytics side when we are providing risk management solutions to our clients. Now, let me start with the headlines first, and then we're going to go into the details, why we're here. We heard from Jessica before the B&M plans, and there will be mandatory climate-related scenario analysis and stress testing coming up in 2024. What I have in this slide is, I would say, a sneak peek, if you like, into the impact from that type of scenario analysis, where essentially I used not only, I would say, Malaysian companies, but I took all the publicly listed firms in Southeast Asia. When I say Southeast Asia, I mean Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and the Philippines. And based on some industry standard scenarios, the NGFS scenarios that you see here, I tried to quantify what is the impact on the credit side on average for the companies that are included in the analysis. And to do that, I use the 10-year horizon because some of the scenarios, for example, specifically the disorderly one that you see there, the late policy action one, assumes that essentially the policies are introduced with a 10-year lag. So just to have something a bit more comparable across the different assumptions, across the different scenarios, I use the 10-year horizon as the kind of the analysis period. And essentially what the table on the right shows is out of all the companies that I use in the sample, what proportion of them will experience over the 10-year horizon a credit deterioration of 1 notch, 2 or more notches deterioration, or what percentage of the companies included in the sample will have the same or better rating than what they have today. And the key point here is to acknowledge that it's not only that we care about ESG because it tends to be the hot topic of the day, but also that can lead to a big financial impact at the very end. And if you look at any scenario, you see that there's a fair chunk of companies that will actually experience a credit deterioration over a period of time. In fact, no matter which scenario you're looking at, you cannot see anything more than 25% of the firms maintaining the same or better rating than what they have today. So they will experience either 1 notch or 2+ notches deterioration if they don't take, obviously, any action over the 10-year period that is included in the scenario analysis that we have performed. And then obviously in the table, and you can get the slides at the end, so there's no need to actually write down the numbers at this point. You can see also the corresponding impact on spreads. Credit spreads. Obviously, if the rating changes, intuitively you would expect the spread to change accordingly as well. So the impact can be substantial, and obviously what I have on this table is the entire sample that includes obviously both sectors that are highly exposed to transition risk and also sectors that are not really exposed to transition risk. So if you average out, this is what you get. But if you actually have and do the same type of analysis for the high transition exposed sectors, then obviously the impact will be much higher than what you see on this particular table. And we're going to see some more numbers later on throughout the presentation. Now, what I showed so far is obviously the final impact, but before you get to the final impact, there are some intermediate steps. And I have actually numbers to share with you across all the different steps. But before we go into the numbers, I thought it would be useful for the audience to also understand a bit what type of methodology we use behind the scenes to actually generate some of these metrics. We heard about disclosures before. So what I have on this slide is essentially how we use those disclosures and how we translate the information from those disclosures into ESG metrics. When we actually assess a company from an ESG perspective, as you can see on the slide, we use 38 criteria that you can see at the bottom of the slide. Each criteria obviously has different questions, right? It's not that we use only one question per criteria, but these are the 38 that we use. We split the criteria into 6 domains, namely environmental, human rights, human resources, community involvement, corporate governance, and business behavior. And also we do have some sectorial adjustments as well. So we do have currently, we use 40 sector models and specific sector adjustments that we made at the end. The other important thing to note is that each and every one of those criteria that you see here is assessed across 3 pillars. So we don't just assign a single score to each one of those 38 criteria, but we actually have 3 scores for each one of them. So we assess leadership, meaning the commitments that the company has made and also the ownership of those commitments. We assess the implementation, which essentially means the credibility of those commitments or whether the company has the means allocated to deliver on those commitments, if you like. And then we also assess the results, which means the KPIs that they have in place and also whether they have a track record implementing those commitments. And obviously, this is where the controversies fit into as well. Right, any company that has a controversy, obviously that will lower a lot their results score. Okay, so scoring each and every one of the 38 criteria across the 3 different pillars, obviously you will get an E, an S, and a G score at the end. And then once you aggregate across all 3, you will have the consolidated ESG score that you see at the far right. We use a continuous kind of spectrum of scores from 0 to 100. 0 is the lowest one, 100 is the best that you can actually achieve. Okay, now with this, I just want to quickly flash this slide before we go into the numbers. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into every country that you see on this slide. It's a lot of information. But as I said, I mean, since you're going to get a copy of the slide, I'm going to just focus on Malaysia, given obviously the audience today. And if you look at Malaysia, I have on the left-hand side of this slide information across both ESG, and the components of ESG, E, S, and G. I have what we call TCFD strategy, which is essentially the alignment of the disclosures of a company to TCFD requirements. And then obviously I do have the exposure to climate risk in terms of average emission levels and also exposure to physical risk. Now, one thing to note is that this is not the sovereign score, no, it's just the average score of the companies that operate within that country, right? So we do score every company, and then we just take the average at the country level, just to get a bit of an average view across different countries. Now, if we look at Malaysia, for example, you see that at least for the companies that we have, and obviously not all these companies are in kind of the high energy, high transition exposed sectors. So there are many kind of financial institutions and so on, included in the sample. In terms of overall ESG performance, the companies in Malaysia, they're not doing too badly, I would say. They're actually, the average score of 32 is reasonably high. Even though I have to make a note here that in terms of the sample in Malaysia of companies with disclosures and companies that we have actually assessed is not the biggest sample across all the different countries that you see here on this particular slide. So not as many companies, for example, we have in Malaysia as compared to Singapore or as compared to the UK and Australia. But nevertheless, the overall ESG score is reasonably high. The one, I would say, area of concern, and that's something that obviously was highlighted before, is the TCFD strategy column. That, yes, the companies that do disclose in terms of ESG, they're not doing too badly, but in terms of their alignment of those disclosures, TCFD principles, on average, the companies in Malaysia are not quite there yet. So there's quite a bit of work to be done because I would say the average score of 26.2 is, I would say, towards the bottom of the list. Now, beyond the ESG assessment, now the companies in Malaysia and obviously in the other countries as well, they're exposed to transition risk and also physical risk. Now, exposure to physical risk is reasonably high in Malaysia, 76.7. And I would say, I mean, because it was mentioned before as well, the country is exposed to floods, for example. For the companies operating near the shoreline, obviously they are exposed to sea level rise and so on. So physical risk is an important risk for companies operating in Malaysia, and it's not something that we can just ignore, right? And on the right-hand side, what I have is now I move away from the country split. I just now split by sectors. And across sectors, I do have the average emission levels and also the average ESG score. Now, without going into the details of the different sectorial differences, the one key thing to note is that having high emissions doesn't necessarily mean that you have a bad ESG score, right? For example, if you look at the electricity and gas utilities that have obviously by far the highest average emission levels, the average ESG score for the sector is 33.3, while at the same time broadcasting and advertising at the bottom of the list, where obviously they have the lowest emissions, they have also an average ESG score of 21, which is obviously much worse than the electric and gas utilities, right? So the point here is that high emissions doesn't automatically mean a bad ESG score, right? So because if the companies obviously start doing a lot to address their exposure to transition risk, for example, their ESG score will typically be much better as compared to not doing anything about it. And a quick note, as I mentioned before, obviously physical risk is not something that for Southeast Asia is something that we can just ignore. For most of the countries, is a significant type of risk, either for the operations of their obligors, if we're talking about financial institutions, or for the operations of the company itself. Right. Now, for Malaysia specifically, obviously is not highly exposed to hurricanes, or as highly exposed to hurricanes as compared to Philippines or Vietnam, for example. But but as a country, it is highly exposed to floods, as we saw recently as well. Right. And obviously, when we're talking about physical risk, this is just a country view. But physical risk can be extremely different depending on which part of the country we're looking at. And when we're talking about quantifying physical risk, we are talking actually at quantifying physical risk at the specific location that the companies operate in. Now, obviously, on our end, we have made significant investment in that space by acquiring 427 a couple of years back, which is a leading provider of physical risk scores. But also we acquired RMS late last year, which is the leading provider of catastrophe modeling. So, for example, we do have clients that want to just estimate how much am I going to lose if there's a catastrophe coming in the next year or two. Then we can actually use the capabilities from the RMS side of the business to quantify this impact. Now to the more interesting part of the presentation. I mean, what I mentioned so far was the standalone ESG or climate risk assessment. The question is, of course, even if you have a score or ESG score of 30, 40, 50, what does that mean in terms of financial impact or credit impact, right? And when we're looking at quantifying the credit impact coming from climate or ESG type of risk, I would say we're looking at two different things. The first one is, what is the impact on the credit ratings today? Okay, and that's very important because obviously it can affect lending decisions or investment decisions, or it can also affect pricing decisions as well for either loans or bonds. The second one, which I'm going to talk about in the following slides, is a forward-looking assessment of the impact. So under a given scenario, what is the projected impact over the coming years for a rating, for the probability of default, or for the loss that you're going to experience, right? So one is the ratings now, the other one is more a projected impact over the coming years. Now, for the ratings first, which some of you might have seen the approach from the rating agency, which is typically what we also follow when we have engagements with our clients, that they're coming to us essentially asking us, how should I adjust my credit models to include ESG? We tend to simplify a bit the process. So first, obviously, we do have the ESG assessment of the particular company, where we essentially, as per the methodology that I described before, we assess every one of the criteria that I mentioned before. We assign a score, and then we aggregate the score up at the company level. We can make obviously some sector adjustments to that as well. And then what we do is we take the final ESG score for that particular company, and we're trying to translate that into what it means for the credit impact. So we translate that ESG score into positive, neutral to low, moderately negative, highly negative, and very highly negative in terms of the credit impact for that particular company. And obviously, the translation mechanism between ESG and the credit impact will vary across sectors, will vary across countries, and will most likely vary across obligors as well, depending on the underlying kind of ESG score that they have. Now, just to give you an indication, that comes actually from the rating agency side of Moody's, and so it refers to the rated universe. We do have two different sectors. One is oil and gas, one is financial institutions, right? And for the oil and gas, if you look at the top half of the slide, you do see that the vast majority of the companies that are rated by Moody's Investor Services do have a credit impact score of 3. Which means that there's going to be a moderately negative impact on the credit rating itself. CIS 2 that you see there, the credit impact score 2, means almost negligible impact on the rating. So CIS 3 and 4 and 5 means obviously there's going to be moderate, severe, and very severe implications for the credit rating. So there is a very big chunk of companies, obviously, that will have a CIS score of 3, and there's also a significant proportion of companies that will have a CIS score of 4 or 5. Now, if we look at the corresponding credit impact scores for the financial institutions, you will see that the vast majority of them, including ESG into the assessment, will not lead to any material changes in the credit ratings. You have the vast majority of them sitting within the CIS 2 bucket, which essentially means that there's not going to be a material impact on the credit rating. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to see any impact whatsoever, right? Depending on how good the rating of the financial institution is right now, you might still observe a one-notch difference even in the final rating, even if you include ESG and the CIS scores too. Okay. And then the second one, I'm rushing a bit because I'm just looking at the time. The second type of impact that I mentioned before is more forward-looking in nature. So here we're looking at scenario analysis essentially. So we're not looking at what the impact will be on the rating today, but we are looking at by how much the rating might change or how much the PDs might change over the coming 5, 10, 20, 30 years into the future under a given scenario. And this is pretty much the methodology that I used behind the scenes to show the first slide that I shared with you, the first table, when I actually had the results of the scenario analysis for the different NGFS scenarios. So here we're looking at starting from the macro assumptions for the climate scenario. We are looking at trying to estimate the impact at the sector level first, right? So what is the implication for the overall P&L of, let's say, the energy sector, the utility sector, the automotive sector, and so on. And then once you have that sector-specific impact at any given point in the future, then you go down and trying to estimate what is the impact on the specific cash flows for the given companies within those sectors. So first, a macro perspective, then sectorial perspective, and then firm-specific impact on the cash flows. And then once you have, obviously, the new cash flows of the given firm under a given scenario, then you can translate that back into what it means for probability of default models or for rating models at the very end. And if we use actually this, I would say, 3-step process, just more numbers similar to what we saw on the first slide, but now I just changed a bit the type of analysis. Now I go by sector, and I take an average type of company, triple B rated or BAA rated, $1 billion US in total assets, and I actually look at the NGFS late policy scenario over a 10-year horizon, and actually trying to quantify what is the projected change in the PD for that particular obligor as compared to the current PD level implied by the rating, by the BAA rating. And obviously, if you do the analysis by industry segments, obviously not surprisingly, you see that the highly, I would say, transition exposed sectors are towards the top of the list, coal being by far the most impacted. And the financial institutions towards the bottom of the list, right? You see some impact in terms of their PDs, but I would say it's a bit negligible as compared to coal or electricity production. At the same time, and even though that has not necessarily been a focus point for the regulators, we do also quantify the capital requirements implied by the PDs that you see on this particular slide. As I mentioned, regulators so far, they haven't really forced banks to change the capital requirements based on climate risk. but it's good to actually translate a bit the PD into what it means for the capital requirements for that particular company in that particular segment, right? And for example, for coal, based on the PD percent change of 180%, that gets translated into an increase in the capital requirements for bank of 67%, right? Which is not definitely is not negligible, right? So if the regulators at some point in the future do include or do adjust the capital requirements of the banks depending on the output of a climate risk analysis, then actually the capital requirements can change quite substantially depending on which sector the obligor operates in. Last slides before we move to the Q&A. I talked a lot about obviously the data aspects and the analytics, but at the same time we need to look at a bit at the journey that a bank, primarily a bank, I would say, needs to take if they are to comply with the regulatory expectations or the investor expectations as well. We heard from Jessica before that BNM is targeting 2024 to do a scenario analysis and TCFD reporting. But at the same time, it's also important to acknowledge that this is something that takes time. It's not something that, you know, a bank says, okay, in a month's time or 2 months' time, I'll be ready to actually report TCFD, right? Because in order to do that, you do need to have the necessary data in place. You do need to have scenarios, climate scenarios in place. You do need to have the credit models to translate those scenarios into what it means for in terms of the financial impact. And then once you do have all these things in place, then you can actually go and disclose according to TCFD requirements. And this is pretty much how we actually structure a bit typically the way we work with banks in the region. In pretty much all the projects that we have, we follow those 4 core phases, I would say. The first one is to try to give the capabilities to the institution to measure and understand a bit their exposure to ESG and climate risk, both for their obligors, for their clients, but also in many cases, the banks themselves or the financial institutions themselves, they're asking us, can you assess us as an institution? So both to understand how am I doing as an institution in terms of ESG as compared to my peer group, but also how my clients are doing, my obligors are doing. So that's typically the first phase. The second phase, we're typically looking at scenario analysis, and this is pretty much where we introduce the concept of climate risk scenarios. And that can lead obviously to TCFD reporting later on for the institutions that want to follow TCFD reporting. And then the third phase involves bringing those analytics and capabilities to the front office. So we are talking about giving to the front office the capability to assess ESG for a new obligor. We are talking about giving the capability to the front office to also adjust the credit rating to incorporate ESG and climate risk considerations. And once obviously you have all these things into place, then you can really talk about portfolio management, how to actually steer the business going forward, decide which part of the business you want to be in, which part of the business you don't want to be in, and also price appropriately, right? That's one of the key considerations for most of the institutions. To what extent kind of including ESG into my assessment will actually adjust change my pricing when it comes to loans. Now, you see at the very bottom of the slide, and that's something that I'm very keen to also emphasize. You can put the best analytics and give the bank the best data in the world, but if you don't have, the people working for the institution understanding really what ESG and climate risk is about, at the end of the day, that will not really be used in the decision-making process. So that's why we do spend a lot of time actually training and also improving the capacity within the institutions to really fully appreciate and understand what we're talking about here and how they can actually use these things into their day-to-day jobs. And with this, I'll maybe stop here and then hand it back to Ben I think we have a Q&A now, right?
Dimitrious, thank you very much for sharing. We'll just go for a couple of minutes, I think, and then go to break. And then if you can come back at 5 p.m, yep. Some messages you'd particularly like to share, that would be great to hear. So if I may just reflect a couple of points from your presentation that really I found interesting and stood out. And one is the way that you've driven through down to quantified numbers more broadly in terms of probability of defaults, and that there's quite a number of steps that need to happen in terms of the modeling to be able to do that. And I thought interesting to see that even in the more moderate climate scenarios, most issuers have some credit implication. I thought interesting to see that Malaysia is doing okay on ESG, but once it gets to TCFD, it's a little further down the list. Some Singapore and Thailand are further ahead. There was a couple of other sort of factors, so yes, banks don't necessarily have a higher probability of default, but that doesn't mean that they're not potentially going to have to take write-downs here and the earnings and profitability won't be affected. So it doesn't mean they can't do, you can't just sit back and say it's okay. You still need to manage the business effectively. So I think it was very interesting to see all of those aspects in a quantified fashion. I wonder, because I do know that this is something that a lot of people focus on, ESG particularly when it's ESG and not just climate, can be very noisy. How do you clean that up? Particularly, how do you clean it up to a point where you can comfortably put it into a quantified model?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. I would say not only noisy, but for me, the biggest issue is that in many cases, the information is not existing, right? Because in many cases, I would say banks or investors are required to do an assessment where the information is not even there in the first place, right? So disclosures are not there, and therefore they cannot actually even get the data. Now, the way I want to think about this is, first of all, for me, the people doing the assessment need to really understand what they need to be looking for. And especially if you look at, for example, in a traditional bank, the front office when it comes to generating a new loan, right? An ESG kind of assessment might be new for many people, right? So even if you give them data, even if you give them disclosures, they're not going to necessarily know what to look for, right? So that's why in my presentation at the very last slide, I emphasize the training and capacity improvement. Because one of the key things is, apart from obviously putting the data and giving the analytics to the bank, is actually spend a lot of hours training the people making the decisions, right? Training them on, first of all, at a high level, what ESG is about, but also training them on what type of information they should be looking for, right? Now, once they actually understand that, I would say for me, the next step is to potentially use some industry best practices to guide a bit your choice of the minimum set of information or factors that you need to consider when you do the assessment. And this is pretty much where we come in as well, right? As a rating agency, our scorecards are scrutinized globally, I would say. So therefore, they are considered to some extent industry best practice. So we do give at least the core set of information that they will need to start collecting from the clients. And then once they actually do that, over time, they can start improving, right? Because I think where we are today, I cannot really say, especially if we look at the SME and mid-markets, mid-corporate markets, or not only Malaysia, that applies to pretty much all the countries, right? We're not quite there in terms of collecting the information required to really do a proper ESG assessment for a given obligor, right? And yeah, for me, it's not, as I said, it's noisy, but also information is not existent. And if you want to fix that, first you change the mindset and you actually properly train the people doing the assessment. And then over time, you start collecting the data based on industry standards, I would say.
Yes, I think so. And sometimes we do have to just make decisions with imperfect information. It's sort of, yes, unfortunately how it is. Well, Dimitrious, thank you ever so much, and I look forward to welcome you back to the panel session at 5. For now, I think let's go to the coffee break, and I think we should let's get back on the schedule and restart at 4 p.m. Everyone. So slightly quicker coffees, but very much looking forward to picking back up with you on the hour. Thank you. Hello and welcome back, everyone, after the coffee break. We are joined, Charlotte is here, so we'll just plough straight back into the proceedings, which certainly have already been very rich. So joining us now is Charlotte Wolfeby, the Chief Sustainability Officer of Petronas. And please note that we will take audience Q&A immediately after this presentation. So please do prepare for that and arrange with Slido. Charlotte Wolfeby, to give a little context, joined Petronas as Chief Sustainability Officer in June of last year. And she'd previously held roles, senior roles in sustainability at Equinor and ArcelorMittal. And prior to her heavy industries career, she's also spent a decade in the telecommunications sector, most notably at Telefonica and O2. So deep corporate experience in sustainability. And so here we are. She's here to share with us today building a sustainable future and the perspective from Petronas. So Charlotte, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Ben, and thanks to you, Dato Chairman and Dato CEO and distinguished colleagues at AmBank and honourable audience. I really like to thank AmBank for this kind invitation. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. So thank you once again, and thank you also for planting a tree for my participation here today. That one tree alone will become home to millions of insects and support a healthy and more sustainable forest. And so I'm truly honoured and grateful. So thank you very much. In my remarks, I would like to cover context around a sustainable future. I also want to cover a little bit about climate change and the energy transition. And then I wish to talk a little bit about Petronas. And I will plow through quite a lot of context because it also sort of sets the frame why Petronas is sort of also taking a step change in this field. And finally, I also want to conclude on a small ask on you all, on you investors. So I'd say that times are changing and the role of business in society is changing. And I would say the past 2 years have changed everything. The world we left behind before COVID-19 is vastly different from today and the future ahead. So right now we are, as we should be, still very concerned about health and the economic effects of billions, I think 4 billions of people moving in and out of lockdowns. But we also come to realize just how vulnerable we are to systemic risks, of which climate change, of course, is one of the most prominent ones. But it's not the only risk we have to contend with. The United Nations lays it out very clearly. We actually have 3 crises on our hands, all relating to sustainable development, namely climate change, loss of nature, and a crisis of inequality or lack of equity, if you like. But if I'm in business or an investor like you, does it matter? Why should I care? Well, I'd say you should care because it does matter. Climate change, loss of nature, and inequality have been on a slow burner for decades, while the pandemic appeared perhaps more abruptly. But why does it feel that we have reached the tipping point now? And I like to argue that it's because we are at a tipping point. We now know for certain that climate change is caused by our actions, and the effects are felt across the world by every single community. It's also evident that the blurring boundaries between nature and people and the destruction of ecosystems, and thus I'm so excited about the tree and the ecosystem it will develop, basically make zoonotic diseases more prevalent, such as the coronavirus. And then we have social norms that are changing too. We have a new generation of decision makers and voters that are coming to the fore with a new outlook on life. They are concerned about the future and triggered by climate change. They're also concerned about their personal well-being, and resilience is really on top of young people's minds nowadays. Now, the perceived lack of action on these 3 crises I mentioned is driving people literally to the streets. We live in a world where even children have actively been demonstrating because of their concern about climate change. And again, driven by their fear for their future, the Swedish teenager Greta Thunberg has mobilized hundreds of thousands of school children to march for a better future every Friday for weeks on end. So this was just before the lockdowns. Now, in the UK, we also have a group called Extinction Rebellion, which has sort of grown and mushroomed up in many other countries since. And this is an extreme grassroots movement promoting action on climate change through the act of civil disobedience. Extinction Rebellion has caused complete gridlocks of transport hubs all across Europe, with enormous economic losses for several weeks on end. As an example, I used to live in London, and there's a big ring road around the city called the M25. They glued themselves to the road. Just sort of one example. Now, you may not agree with these tactics, but actually I claim that activists are being listened to because social norms are changing. The general mood is changing, and it's not just in the streets of London or Paris, but all around the world, and the effects are widely felt also here in Asia. Now, moving on to climate change and energy transition. Now, climate science tells us that we must drastically cut emissions already by 2030. So that means we have 8 years to cut emissions drastically and to halt deforestation pretty much immediately. So this is what scientists say to avert the worst effects of climate change. Now, I don't need to tell you all how bad the situation is, but we can't, for instance, rule out a sea level rise of 2 meters or more. There are estimates of 40% of the world's population to be affected by persistent heat waves and so on. The situation is not good. And the whole situation, so the state of the climate is sort of very uncomfortable really to fathom. But it is something we can address. The passage is narrow, but it is doable. And this is also where the opportunity lies, ensuring enough energy for the world's growing population and for that to be climate friendly. And that means delivering a net zero carbon emission energy system, meaning changing how we produce, deliver, and consume energy, and for that to be basically a whole of society transformation. So this was also what the recent climate summit, COP26 in Glasgow, was focusing on. And this image here you can see with Greta Thunberg mentioned there is one of those demonstrations at COP26. Now, I'm sure you didn't miss all the media, a storm around it. Now, the summit ended in a compromise, I think we can conclude, where every party had to let go of something. But I think we can also conclude that the direction is now very clear. The world at Glasgow concluded that we should keep 1.5 degrees alive. And that means limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And by doing that, we would avoid the worst effect of climate change. This is a big deal. There's a big difference between well below 2 degrees, which is written in the Paris Agreement, and sort of trying to stick to global warming no more than above 1.5 degrees. So again, just to reiterate, we must double down on reducing our emissions and aim for drastic cuts in the next 8 years. So this means, I think we can really conclude that the energy transition will both accelerate and scale up in pace and magnitude. And here we see governments responding. So net zero has become the principle to organize all other actions on climate change. And governments are now feeling the impatience among their electorate. In the last few months, several new governments have been elected into office based on their climate manifestos, and Canada, Norway, but also most notably perhaps Germany. And we now have net zero targets nationally that represent 90% of global GDP. This is a massive change. If you think 3 years ago, there was none of that. Now we have 90% of world GDP committing to a net zero future. So we see policies and investments being fast-tracked across national jurisdictions. and is all around building back better and greener societies as we are emerging out of the current COVID pandemic. And the annual compound growth rate of climate change related regulation is a staggering 58%. So I'd say the direction is pretty clear where we're going. And also here in Malaysia, the government has announced a net zero ambition as early as 2050 and reducing emissions by 45% by 2030. And you can see a few more detailed activities listed here on the slide, which is quite recent announcements by Malaysia in support of the proceedings in Glasgow. We also earlier during our session here today heard about the progressive work led by Bank Negara, which is equally critical as we are sort of forging our pathway towards 2050. So there are really many new policy developments in the making to accelerate these emission reductions. But why are governments actually stepping up to this? So green growth opportunities are valued anywhere between $2 to $5 trillion by 2030 across several sectors. You are investors. I don't need to tell you how much $2 to $3 trillion is. I'm not an investor, so I had to look it up. You go many times to the moon if you line up dollar bills worth $1 trillion. These are staggering amounts of money and staggering opportunities that industries can really capture. So we have, of course, renewable energies such as solar and wind that are already competitive against coal and gas in several markets, not everywhere, but in some markets already. We've seen, for instance, a 7-fold growth in solar over the last decade. Now that sounds like a lot, but actually it's not enough. The International Energy Agency in its 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario basically says that if we want to reach our goals of net zero carbon emissions by 2050, the world must get into the habit of building the world's biggest solar park every day. So whatever we're doing now is kind of a little bit drop in the ocean. So we really need to ramp up and do so fast. So governments are stepping up, but I would say industries are also responding. We now know, for instance, that fossil-free steel is possible. There is a pilot project in Sweden showing that it's technically possible and proven to produce steel without fossil fuels. We see in our sector, in the energy sector, peer companies changing their business models. We have Shell that has announced that it aims to become the world's biggest utility company. Occidental in the US, a oil and gas producer, now becoming a carbon management company. We have Ørsted in Denmark, formerly known as Danish Oil and Gas Company, now doing none of that. They're only focusing on wind power. And Equinor, formerly known as Statoil, the Norwegian national oil company, now becoming one of the leading offshore wind producers in the world. Now, the pace of the energy transition will only increase. And we've actually seen government plans across the world calling for sort of investment in the tune of $98 trillion that needs to go into the energy systems by 2050 in support of their policies. So the only future is a low carbon future, a one where energy is both sustainable and affordable to everyone. Now, from a business perspective, it's all about resilience in this new context. So what does it mean to a business like Petronas? We aim to drive long-term business value through responsible investments, triggering sustainable growth for Petronas and broad-based opportunities across the whole value chain. So for us at Petronas, this means, of course, proactively manage transition risk and capture the upsides. So this means developing new value pools with increased valuation, improve efficiency measures, obtain favorable rates on the bond market, and continue to be relevant and a high-value global brand as we are today. So what are we doing? We've set out our 2050 net zero carbon emissions aspiration. We did so as the first Asian oil and gas company last year. And this is now one of 3 pillars in our value creation strategy, as you can see on this slide. The detailed roadmap for our net zero ambition is still under development, but the main building blocks are well understood. So first, of course, our core oil and gas business must be resilient to lower commodity prices and higher carbon prices. In operational terms, we will drive or require sort of actions at all levels, and this includes driving down costs, improving energy efficiency and resource use. We must reduce flaring and venting of gas and methane emissions, and also look at electrifying industrial processes wherever possible. But we must also help our customers reduce their emissions from the use of our oil and gas products and help displace more polluting fuels. So we have strong ambitions to grow in renewables, and we also consider investments in nature-based carbon sinks. We are introducing carbon capture and storage, and this is something we're working on an engineering side right now. And we're also developing proprietary technology and new value chains around hydrogen, biofuels, and other growth areas. So all of these are markets with great growth potential. And as we are talking here to the investor community, and we heard from Bank Negara before, I also wanted to mention that we are preparing to report on our progress in alignment with the recommendations by the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, so the TCFD. So our time frame is 2023 for that. Now, we can't do this alone. This is absolutely critical because this is a big transformation, not just for us, but also for Malaysia. So we really want to work with our suppliers across Malaysia and globally. And this is not just about reducing emissions or finding the next big low carbon solution. It's also about creating new, meaningful jobs and offering more opportunities for more people. We want to capture some of that opportunity. You might remember I mentioned that governments have pledged that there's sort of a need for $98 trillion flowing into the new energy systems globally. We want to bring that opportunity home to Malaysia and serve some of that need from here. So from Petronas' perspective, this really signals our expansion into a portfolio also beyond oil and gas, well into the broader energy space. And this is the right direction because we see opportunity in the energy transition and also delivering profit with purpose, if you like. But I would like to conclude to talk a little bit about you investors. Now, we can all agree that, of course, that we can't ignore climate change. The human, environmental, economic costs or impact would be just too destructive. So, and we know to a large extent technologically how to decarbonize the energy system. This is kind of known. And we also know that the cost of deploying this technology for an energy transition is still affordable if measured in relation to GDP over the longer term, though. And there's a bit of a but here. In the near term, we need to see enormous investments in this, in the energy systems. So for you, the investors, you need to channel your investments into the energy transition. Now, for you to do so, you probably want to see a relatively low risk profile and policy certainty. Well, let me tell you, I think that's actually now in place. Policy certainty is there. We have certainty of net zero targets all across the world and strong action from governments across the world. Regulation is making ESG increasingly the default option to invest. And here I must pause for a second. I have a phone on my desk that has never rang since I joined Petronas. It's ringing now, so I'm just going to kill it off. Just one moment. Very unfortunate timing, pardon me. So where was I? Yes, so regulations making ESG increasingly kind of the default option, but we don't have a pro forma for how to fund and invest in the energy transition. And hereby lies a dilemma. We are seeing permanent or witnessing permanent outflows of capital from oil and gas into renewables. That's okay. That's actually perfect. We do need to see a lot of capital going into renewables. But this shouldn't mean that the oil and gas sector or other high emitting sectors such as cement and steel or others should be starved of capital. There are many pressure groups advocating for exactly this. Right now, capital is essential that we can develop and deploy decarbonization technologies and develop new industries and business models, for instance, for hydrogen. So an immediate wholesale shift from fossil fuels straight into renewables overnight, I can tell you, won't actually deliver the energy the world needs, nor will it keep energy affordable or accessible. It would also not necessarily bring the climate benefits that we so desperately need, as we must also repurpose existing infrastructure where it exists, as existing infrastructure already has much embodied carbon. So for instance, especially in OECD countries, we must repurpose gas infrastructure for hydrogen, for instance, rather than abandon it and build everything new. There's just not enough carbon budget for us to be rebuilding everything. And also, if we would have a wholesale shift tomorrow, national economies would take a major hit and people would suffer. So there is no one solution to this complex problem of climate change. We need a transition so that all sectors of society can decarbonize. Now, there won't be a transition without the investor community, so we really need you on board. We need transition finance that's affordable, accelerates the transition away from polluting resources, and thirdly, ensures a just transition, one that creates better prospects for more people. And I say this because the energy transition requires a complete transformation of modern society. And this is once in a generation, I think once in a century opportunity we have to fix some of the bigger challenges in society. So my ask here today is that we together work as a community to build on existing taxonomies to define sustainable investments for a just energy transition, both for Malaysia, but also for the ASEAN region. So thank you very much.
And Charlotte, thank you very much, and particularly for throwing down the gauntlet there to the investment community to come up with a more nuanced approach, I think, is rather than sort of pure divestment on thresholds. And I can share that the investors that we work with are thinking about exactly that. You know, what might be an appropriate exclusion threshold in the European context may not be this. It may not work in an Asian context where actually that's an entity that needs support and needs capital in order to make those transitions, whether the investments are on the R&D side or whether the investments are into the new capex. And so thank you very much for sharing that. If I could just start with a question more about Petronas itself. So you mentioned a number of activities that can be taken. There was flaring, venting, electrification, and then also the customer emissions aspect, and then a few different technology solutions, carbon capture, hydrogen, etc. And I wonder, to what extent, you know, are you able to share anything about the mapping out and the sequence and the proportions, just to give a little bit more color to the list that you suggested there?
So let me just think about that. Obviously, I knew the question was coming, but it's quite difficult to respond in the sense that we are now, Petronas and other industry players and investors and others, we're creating new industries. So what's very interesting, for instance, about hydrogen is that you develop the supply, but you also need to create the demand and the infrastructure to go with it. And you probably need some policy development too, to be allowed to do what you want to be doing. So, and this multiply that for almost all of the new sort of forms of energy. It's quite complicated and complex, and that doesn't mean you shouldn't be busy doing it. But what it does, it requires a completely different model of operations. It's a complete partnership model. So if I can give you an example, I used to work for Equinor, as you mentioned before, the Norwegian national oil and gas company. And we were very busy working on a carbon capture and storage project that sort of cuts across the whole North Sea. The first thing we had to do is to get a whole legal change in the EU, because it's not legal to transport CO2. So, so it really is a multifaceted sort of approach or you have to take when you look into these new areas. So in Petronas, we are looking at a number of different areas, both from engineering, but also R&D. We cast our net quite widely because we have that reach and the capability and also the partnerships. I can't say too much about it, but what is very public knowledge is we have a number of memoranda of understanding around carbon capture and storage, but also hydrogen, and we're also looking at aviation fuel with biofuels. So there's a number of different areas. We're also very active in the chemical space. So I don't think we are unique in that way. There's a lot of, I think there's so much activity right now in this space, and it's a huge exciting area to be in because there's so much new and transformative activities happening all the time. So sorry to not quite respond to your question, but I guess I'm again opening a door wide open to investors, because we all need to kind of play our role and put in risk capital where things haven't been done before, be a bit more patient about the returns, and also work with regulators about, you know, and have demonstrator projects and things like that, just to make sure we get a very conducive business environment.
Okay, so it sounds like commercialization and policy uncertainty create challenges to articulate in a quantified fashion, but that doesn't mean that they aren't going to happen. I think
quite right. And just to add to that, the big policies or the signals are all there. So now it's just the detailed regulation that we kind of have to work through.
Okay, I just want to turn to one of the Slido questions. There's a couple that are up, one I think for Bank Negara, but one that possibly does touch on your area. So the question says, as a small business, I can only reduce the usage of electricity and water, install solar PV, plant trees. What else can I do to achieve carbon neutral by 2050? I don't know if you want to take that. I was thinking about your comments on supply chain. This is more on the customer side.
I think there's so much. Every little helps, absolutely, and I think where we all need to be better, and I think where we really need to double down also here in Malaysia, and I know there's a lot of effort going into this right now, is that also SMEs and middle-sized companies need to huddle together, if you like. We need to share knowledge and understanding frameworks and tools, and also do really effective knowledge sharing of, so you might be, you said I'm only maybe planting trees, putting PVs and on the rooftop and so on, but many are probably not even doing that. And so that is a very good contribution. And also, how do you do it with a good return, if you like? What are the pitfalls? How can we scale it up? Maybe if you have a good experience of how to electrify your energy, maybe you can help the community around you. There's all these opportunities to, I think, scale up by working through networks effectively.
Okay, so we're already, unfortunately, at pretty much the end of the time, but I did want to give you just sort of an opportunity if you wanted to sort of present any further key messages for the audience here today.
I do have a message, and I would say the investor community and the banking sector of the world has really, really stepped up now, I would say, to sort of address climate change. I don't know if you remember, we had a bit of a banking crisis like a decade ago, and what different winds we're feeling now. This is wonderful. It's a little late, but it's great to be here. So, but I would challenge maybe everybody on this call is that how can I, in my position, how can my organization really sort of scale up and enable a just energy transition, so that we really take whole society into the right direction, and we don't end up in a situation like Europe right now, where the energy systems and the policies all in disarray and people can't afford their bills and all of this. We need to make sure that it's a win-win situation, but think about, what can I do differently to actually be an enabler in this process? So that would be my point, I guess, my giveaway.
Okay, how to be an enabler. Charlotte, thank you very much indeed. As you are all very aware, we will all be watching the announcements from Patronus as they come out in due course in all of the different areas that you suggested. Thank you for sharing today.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right. And so now we have, again, a different perspective, a different change. We're able to welcome our hosts on the topic of curating a sustainable strategy. Dato Sulaiman Mohammed Tahir, Group Chief Executive Officer of AmBank Group. Dato's banking career has spanned more than 3 decades, and he was appointed to this role in November 2015. Since then, he's fostered transformation through innovation at AmBank, particularly with a focus on digital adoption. His responsibilities include, of course, delivery of AmBank's strategy, and one part of that is ESG integration, which is the part that we'll hear about today. So without further ado, Dato Sulaiman, if I can turn over to you for your presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ben, very much. Clearly, I mean, if you hear the discussions that we had earlier, I mean, banks, generally financial institutions, are not the biggest emitter of GHG, by virtue that if you look at the entity itself, i.e. as an entity, you know, we hardly produce anything that produce carbon dioxide, nor methanes or, you know, other gases. And the only thing we do, of course, you know, we have cars, you know, for our staff, and at all, it will have, you know, carbon dioxide emissions. Then that's kind of scope 1. So we do our best. And then with regards to scope 2, if you look at in the way that transition is being measured, is really the energy that we use. And some of the efforts, at least we do, is that, you know, when can we then replace the current you know, energy consumption that we are doing via, you know, like TNB? Can we then go into things like solar, which we are doing clearly. Of course, the scope 3 part, which is the bigger ambition, where it involves our suppliers as well as our customers. I think that's where I think the biggest difficulty lies, i.e. Banks being banks. I think the lending and the deposit taking that you do is across all industries. And there's a question of next is, how do you then measure, you know, the industry's impact in a sense on the climate? Then the question is, how we then work as an intermediary, influencing the behavior, you know, of our customers. Then the issue that, of course, our suppliers, I think, which is manageable, but I think the bigger issue is really, you know, measuring the impact, you know, of our customers on the environment, and how do we have a standard way of measuring them, and say to what extent can then we work with them. We've put up clearly things like business that we don't want to do, which is the negative list. Then this issue of high impact industries like oil and gas, resources, mining, clearly energy. Those are the areas that we say how we then work with our customers, helping them to transition, you know, from a high producer of, let's say, GHG, mitigation, how do they then, you know, move towards a reduction in whatever they're doing in terms of contributing to CO2. So there's something that we are doing. The question is next is, how do you put metrics and measurements around it? Yes, we are committed to have a net zero ambition as in the Malaysian government ambition by 2050. But question is, what milestones can you build along the line? That's really the bigger challenge. But hence, it doesn't mean that you don't do anything. It means that, you know, you got to do something. It's better something than nothing. Then question is, that's where, you know, we begin, you know, our ESG journey, at least in AmBank Group. Moving on to the first slide. So when we first started, you know, our ESG journey was way back sometime in 2017. where we created what we call a sustainability working group, essentially to look into areas where we can focus on driving sustainability. We actually broke down into 3 areas, which is essentially us as a company, the way that we do our business. Then there's this issue of responsible banking, and then this impact that we have on society. So clearly that was the beginning, and we identified 4 UN SDGs, the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals, in terms of how we can meet those. That was way back in 2017, and then we started to have GHG emissions, at least on our side, looking at, as I've mentioned earlier, scope 1 and 2. Actually the bank itself as an entity in terms of its GHG emissions. The whole idea was to create a lot of awareness among staff, amongst bankers, amongst our RMs. What does it mean, to be a conscious citizen of the world, i.e. responsibility towards contributing to the environment. In 2019, we started to have our policy put in place, where we identified 9, today I think it's 10 UN SDGs focus areas that we want to work on. And then we launched our energy efficient plan, where we had started to look into how do we then look at alternative sources of energy consumption, at least for scope 2. And then in 2020, we had our sustainability framework done. All this is to set the fundamentals in terms of how do we drive ESG. And then we had the practice guides implemented as well. And internally, we run a lot of campaigns and activities within staff. And we are also, as mentioned by our Deputy Governor earlier, an active participant in the joint joint climate committee that we have, with the regulator. It's only sometime in 2020 we formalized the framework. Then we started the Group Sustainability Council, chaired by me, sometime in July 2020. And then we started to introduce KPIs. I mean, if you don't have measurements, then you can't get things done. And hence, all my C-suite direct reports have specific KPIs in terms of driving initiatives on ESG. And sometime in October 2020, we had the CCPT guidelines came out, and hence question is, as we establish our internal rating on ESG risk grade, we call ESG risk grade, we have now put an overlay of the climate change principle taxonomy given by the regulator on top of our ESG rating, where we had a classification of rating of our customers from high, medium, and low. And we are in the midst of actually doing the certification right now. Of course, it involves a series of interviews, questions in terms of the practices, by our customers. How do we establish the governance framework of the way that we drive ESG? I think in the bank, it was sometime way back in 2019. If you look at the structure we've done, moving to the next slide, Tina, is really involving all members of the structure that we have, from the C-suites, the people that they are responsible for creating a group sustainability department, a dedicated unit that focus on driving ESG, establishing a council that reports to the group risk committee, I think, in the bank, and subsequently, of course, to the board. And I've mentioned to you the 3 themes that we were focusing on is really the responsible banking, which is the toughest part, which is the scope 3, the conscious self-conduct. This is scope 1 and 2, and of course, the society impact in terms of the activities that we do. And hence, this is how the 3 themes. And then we look at the UNDP sustainable goals, and we say, how can we then support those initiatives? And we use I got my CEO of Islamic to drive these, focusing really on the value-based intermediary initiatives that we have, as you can see on the right-hand side, the Islamic principles of Maqasid. Now, how do we integrate the sustainability risk in our lending and financing practices? Clearly, we had an exclusion list that we have listed on the left-hand side. So you have those businesses, if we have, then we'll look into how do we then phase them out, and then and we have new applications. We say, how do we then don't do those businesses? What we then look is that then the next phase is to look into the existing portfolio, where we classify our clients or our exposures, which is a scope 3 part, into low risk, medium risk, and high risk. And I must say that we've done this certification on most of our clients, and we find that a lot of the exposures that we have are essentially low risk. And recently, as recent as late last year, we're starting to incorporate the climate change principle-based taxonomy recommended by BNM, according to the principles. We're in the midst of actually doing the certification of all our customers, specifically enhancing the E part of our ESG rating. So if you move to the next slide, what it means to us as a practitioner, as a bank, is really having your ESG risk grade, given to a customer, and then you have your credit risk grade, which is your obligor rating based on your credit rating as well as your credit assessment done, and giving us that decision in terms of, do we do lending or don't we do lending to those customers? And if they fall into a high risk grade, then there's no clear mitigation. Then the issue is we just kind of don't do those loans. And if they fall into medium, then we'll look into the mitigating plans in terms of what do they have, what do they do to reach a certain goal in terms of impact on climate. And of course, if they are low, it's something that, if they pass the credit score, that's something that, we will then approve. So clearly that process that we have put in place in terms of looking at ESG rating, looking at the credit rating, of our customers, resulting to the credit decisions, where at the committee level, approval level, they actually make the decisions incorporating those two elements, i.e. the risk grade of the customers based on their credit, as well as their ESG scoring based on a methodology, where we score customers according to their score on ESG, which we classify as low, medium, or high risk. Now, moving on to the next page, from a perspective of TCFD, clearly there are guidelines put in place. As mentioned by our regulators, is something that we need to comply by 2024. That's clearly something that we will do, and we are committed to want to do this. And clearly, if you look at the phase 1 of TCFD, we have it. Phase 2, something that we are working on, where we have specific metrics that we can put in place to measure in terms of what's the ambition. And of course, phase 3 is the scenario and the testings, the resilience testings that we do. And that, as mentioned by our regulator, is to be done by 2024. That's something that we want to do as we start to do the scoring on our customers and overlaying with measurement on climate change as well in terms of scoring. Moving on to the next page, we are a member of the Association of Malaysia, and we subscribe to this. So clearly, to achieve a carbon net zero by 2050 is something that we will do, and we're committed to it. And clearly, as part of the banking institution, we are committed to incorporate ESG in our governance and risk management. As you can see, what we've done in scoring our customers on their ESG risk grades. And we are committed to identify, mitigate, and manage risks of modern slavery and human rights on the social side. We are pretty much committed there. And on the agribusiness, it's something that we will support. Clearly, food shortages is a concern. That's something that we will do. And encourage sustainable practices among high-impact industry sectors of ESG. Again, as I said, how do we then work with industries high impact, working with them in terms of transitioning, moving from the business that they do, which is high risk, by virtue that they are, carbon emitters, to get to net zero by 2050. And certainly we're committed to the social financial inclusion as well, as you can see some of the activities that we've done. And reporting TCFD, something that we're committed to do. And we will do it, by that period. Now, opportunities in ESG, how do we see opportunities in the ESG space? Transition finance is clearly something that we're seeing a lot of. Lending and financing, green technology financing. We see a lot of business out there taking advantage of solar panel supply to TNB, which we do a lot. Green building. In fact, when we have sessions with our customer, I think some customers this morning, we talk about financing green buildings. And of course, specific products that drives environment conscious activity, something that we will support. Capital markets, green sukuk bonds, again, in areas that of interest to a lot of investors as well. And fund management, we had our sustainable series created. And of course, beyond just financing is how do we then continue to work with our customers on many others apart from just sustainable activities is on financial literacy, on the social part of things. Now, the challenges for us really, or for the banking community, is really about measuring ESG in businesses. As mentioned earlier, how do we then measure the industries out there in terms of their particularly on GHG emissions? That is a bit difficult because there's no standards. It's just based on declaration. How do we overcome it? Then the question is, based on the declaration, is then we do that ascertainment, then come to that measurement that we have at this stage. Pretty rudimentary, but again, it's something that hopefully we can, as over time, evolve to have more specific impact measurement on the environment. Then it's question of consistency, clarity from authorities in terms of measuring carbon emissions throughout by industries or by business. And hence, there's no standard way of really measuring those. Then the things like unwinding exposure or working with high impact industries, because really some of these industries are moving towards that, but it's a long period. But the question is, do they have clarity in terms of their plan on the milestones, in terms of decoupling or moving away or transitioning from high intensive carbon emissions businesses to a lower one, or switching their businesses. There's cost, there's time, there's regulatory, there's customers that needs to be managed. Then mobilization of capital funds to go to the net zero journey. I know that the regulators come up with funds like LTCF, something that we're looking forward to in terms of how do we support small business. And again, as I said, data is critical, and data gaps remains an issue. But then again, as I said, that at this stage is really about working with our customers, understanding them, a lot of interactions and questionnaires, and some rudimentary way of measuring in terms of the impact on the climate. Some of the activities we have done, this race is really about educating customers beyond financing, including in green financing, digitalization, looking into ways of reducing consumption of the traditional energy, but rather look at renewables. SME startup is really on the social side. How do we then encourage businesses to start a business out there, and the right way of doing business, the ESG way of doing business. And we are the first bank in Malaysia to do a photovoltaic panels, i.e. this is the scope one part. How do we become conscious citizens to actually make sure that we actually get our energy, scope two part, where we source our energy from renewables rather than from traditional. Then we are part of FinCo. In fact, we are on the board of FinCo, which is the Financial Industry Collective Outreach Programs, which we do to help, to provide social help, particularly to young students, out there, where we have actually appointed a CEO who runs, FinCo. We are part of the committee, and also I'm a director of FinCo as well, And of course, as recent as today, because of the session that we have today, we sponsored and work closely with Yayasan Hijau. And because of your participation, we contributed a tree, i.e. So that's where I think some of the things that we do to drive, change in terms of behavior as well as contribution towards the environment. We've got some recognitions based on the metrics that we have done. You can see some of the awards we've won, some of the ratings has been given to us, and clearly from RAM, from MSCI, from a FTSE Russell perspective, SUSBA. We won the Asia Money Best Bank Awards on CSR. Some other sustainability related awards, as you can see, listed, on the right-hand side. Okay, so those are some of the things that we do in AmBank in terms of driving ESG. Clearly, it's something that we feel that, as Malaysian banks, I think we can't work in a vacuum. You have to be part of it. And clearly, it's a very important agenda. And I think the difficulty is always the measurement in terms of creating milestones to get to where, we want to be. All right, then. Thank you. Ben, back to you. Yeah.
Dato Sulaiman, thank you very much for that sharing and real overview of all of the different aspects of the journey so far and into the future. I guess I can quickly share from the what I know of the institutional and investor perspective. The ones that we work with will be particularly pleased to see both the coal-fired power policy exclusion that's coming in, and also that the net zero 2050 commitment is now there. That's something that they absolutely do focus on. So I guess just in terms of your thoughts, a little bit more future oriented, where do you see some of the best opportunities for the bank in serving your customers? What do you think are the segments where this could be material for you?
I think some of the things that, because the banks, they are intermediary, and I think the creation of a new product of financial instruments that can support, ESG initiatives is something that, that there's an opportunity. The intention is how do we then, because this new business as a result of this shift or transition to be more ESG oriented. A lot of businesses are doing investments into this transition. Then the question is, how do we then work with them to help them to move into this space? And there's the issue of products itself. For example, from the perspective of EV cars, there's something that's coming. The question is, what products can we create to actually drive this and support this? Because clearly there's a new demand in terms of moving in that direction. And then the question next is, how do we come closer to our customers by virtue that this is a new thing, respect of us, the nation has committed to achieve net zero by 2050. The question is, what do you do? Advisory, working, enhancing our relationship with our customers. Those are some of the opportunities that we look at. And as a source of funding as well, i.e. how do we help customers get the best source of funding to make the transition? Again, it's an opportunity. It could be from regulators, it could be from philanthropy, it could be from anyone out there, or investors who wants to put money and then drive in, and it has to make commercial sense, for the business to transit. So those are some of the areas of opportunities that we see. Ben. Yeah.
Dato, I think that completely echoes many of the journeys that we've seen through time. So what can often happen is it starts from a relationship manager perspective. It starts with some kind of compliance, whether it's the regulator or whether it's the leadership team saying you've got to go and speak to your client about this, and and then they do that, and then suddenly they realize, oh, hang on a second, my client is going to need to do this, and then that risk opportunity juncture starts to become a better and closer relationship through time. We do actually see that on quite a number of occasions. Having said that, if we could switch for a moment to the other side, the risk side, how do you make sure that you're setting the right balance on risk assessment? You don't want to go too fast, you don't want to go too slow.
So that's where I think the big issue is, because as you know, to move into a sustainable organization, investments are required. And then this issue is what is the payback, i.e. for them. So that's where the uncertainty comes in. It's one thing that the bank wants to support those businesses, but it's another that, if they take on financing, there's loans to be paid back. But if you can't make sense of what you invest in, I think that's where lays the issue, should I make the investments and does it make sense? And that's the part I think the bankers will have to work with the businesses out there and say, if it doesn't make sense, the question is, are there alternatives? So that's where I think the discussions and the debates has to come, because there's no point to be, of course you want to be, compliant to kind of protecting the environment. But the question next is that, can you be in existence after that if you make the investments? Because the cost becomes high. I think that's where the issue really lies. And then the question is, what are the alternatives? What are the options? What are the stages of transitions that we need to work with the companies? It makes commercials and viable sense. And then the funding that goes with it. Some of the other things that is the role of the banks is to say, how do we then look into source of funding that can make this low carbon transition more attractive for customers, right? Questions, can we get people to come and contribute? Either is from the government by virtue, as our DG mentioned, the LTCF funding that's available, and it makes sense in the sense for these people to transition, or could we raise funding for them as there's more awareness and conscious? Because at the end of the day, when you do this transition, it's stated as investments. Then first question is, can it make sense from a commercial viable perspective? And second is that, is the cost something that they can afford, right? So that's the part I think is something that we need to do. Then there's a risk, i.e. can we get that source of funding that can be commercially viable and make sense for the business to transit? And clearly from the bank perspective as well, as we look into our portfolio, as we assess our portfolio, you'll find, situations where, you have issues, whether it's human rights, labor issues, or discrimination issues, in your portfolio. Then question, how do you do a transition? So there's a risk. There's a risk for us, clearly, by virtue of it explodes. The question is going to happen to our exposures. But the question is, even if it doesn't, the question is, how do we then work with the customers to make sure that they do the transition? And there's got to be a cutoff point as well in terms of to what extent then would you allow them to continue to do so long have they really got the transition plan in place. So those are some of the risks, Ben, that we foresee as we go along. Whatever that you do at the end of the day, these are businesses and they want to have something that's commercially viable. Then the question is, how do you balance it?
Sure, and those aren't straightforward questions, and I guess the frontier on those questions is always evolving through time, and in a way that creates its own challenge. It's something that Dimitrious was talking about earlier, that how you bring the bank teams along on that journey. And I wonder if that's something that you'd also be happy to. So how do you build the knowledge internally? How do you help relationship managers anticipate needs and risks of their clients?
I mean, the way to do it is you have to incorporate as part of the way that you run your business. And the way that we run our business is such that we do credit assessment. And when we introduce another element of the credit assessment, which is your ESG rating, then there's a question of a series of training and programs that people has to go through, and it's expected. It becomes part of your process. The intention is to build it as part of your process, and then the training comes in because it makes sense for the RMs or the frontliners before they do a loan, before they take deposits, that they have to go through the screening that's required. And that screening requires for us to train and to be able then to say why you need to do certain things in a certain way and what's the ambition here and what's the intention. And then the impact on the rating as a result. As I've mentioned, I've indicated earlier, you have your credit rating, which is really your obligor rating, your scoring, your assessment, and then you have your ESG rating. Those two has got to tango, right, before a loan can be approved. Then there's a question of if they are not in line, then would the loan, not be approved, or the pricing of the loan may be different depending on the mitigation that they do. And that's where the training comes, and that's where the consciousness and awareness comes from the frontline perspective. It's a journey. It's a journey. You will never get there on day one. It's not as though you can switch on every spine. There's a lot of questions as you go along. Why the pricing is higher? Why are we not doing these loans? Again, there's a question of education, reaching out to the customers, explaining, and hence you got to kind of start in the beginning, and hence over time. As even Dr. Dimitrious mentioned, then you have that acceptance, and acceptance not only in the RM, is the expectations that you built, with the customers as well. And one day our customers will be trained as well, in the sense that if they seek to have enhancement, or if they want to kind of apply for a loan, they understand what's expected in terms of the way that they expect banks to ask about things that relating to their net worth and credit worthiness. Then it goes on the other side of it, the impact of their business, on the environment, social-wise, from a governance perspective, which is important for the long-term relationship between the bank, and its customers.
Okay, thank you. So I was really hearing create the process, and that creates a need and amongst the relationship managers, and then they're incentivized to find out themselves. So when you supply the training, they're like bought in, and then in due course the clients as well. So look, we've again, time has proceeded quickly, and it's time to have the broader panel. So Dato Sulaiman, thank you very much for your own specific session. But if I can now invite both you and everybody else to the speakers from earlier today, Jessica Chu, Deputy Governor of Bank Negara Malaysia, John Leong, Director Southeast Asia and Oceania at CDP, and also Dr. Dimitrious Papanastasiou, Director from Moody's Analytic, EMEA. If I can invite you all back. Good, great, we're all here. So thank you very much. So for the audience, the Slido scan is up on the screen, or else there's the code there, 498499. Please do log into slido.com, enter the code, and you'll be able to type questions in there. We do have one up. We've got two up. Great. So I'll just ask a first question of the full panel while we're waiting for a few more questions to come up, and then turn to those. I have to say, in terms of the agenda, the discussions that we've heard today, there have been some key strong themes coming through, at least for me, that there is a strong approach that's being expected by the regulator, certainly in terms of international standards. And there's certainly a sense in which the market is accepting that ESG and climate change need to be embraced, and a desire to move fast. There's challenges in terms of information, some of which are being addressed. There are risks to delaying because of imperfect information, but that also the transition is going to need strong government regulation in a number of different areas. It won't just be about the financial system, it also needs to be the real economy. Okay, we've got about 5 questions up, so I'll just go straight to them. The first one, Jessica, was very much addressed to you in a sense. So could you elaborate further on how or what kind of climate change stress testing is going to be carried out in 2024 by the bank, or by Bank Negara?
Thank you very much. So we're still in very early stages of designing the stress test. Our current priority is to develop the scenarios, and we're looking largely at the NGFS scenarios and picking at least 3 scenarios that we will be running stress tests around, and then thereafter it will be really about the data that we would need to put together to run these stress tests, and then engaging with the financial industry on preparations towards that. So it will be a standalone climate change stress test at this point that we're thinking around, but kind of looking then at how those climate impacts transmit through to the financial other financial risks of the institutions. So that's broadly where we're at right now.
Thank you very much. There's the second question, which is also a broader regulatory question around regulatory incentives. What do panel? I'll throw this to the panel. Anybody that would like to respond on this. So carbon tax, grants, soft loans, interest-free loans. What could we expect from the government and/or regulators, and perhaps for the international speakers? Maybe what have you seen working in other markets? Maybe Jessica, seeing as it is a regulatory question, I'll ask you first.
Okay. Well, the government has indicated and is working on some of, under the 12 Malaysia plan as well. They are looking at several, I suppose, enablers or incentives, if you like, and they include the domestic emissions trading scheme and carbon tax. There's not a lot of detail out right now, but you know, we understand that sometime this year the government does intend to elaborate on its proposals around those initiatives. On the financial front, I think, you know, aside from the funds, which I've already spoken about, which kind of locks in low-cost funding for financial institutions to on-lend for transition activities, you know, we are looking at regulatory incentives, maybe initially more from a disincentive, if you like, perspective, kind of looking to make sure that financial institutions are conscious and sizing up their concentrations to climate risk exposures, and then considering whether, for example, under the capital framework, Pillar 2 is certainly one of the perspectives that we're currently considering on whether, if there are significant concentrations to climate risk exposures, then a capital add-on under Pillar 2 is something that we're open to and we are exploring currently. So on the positive side, on incentives, I think you know, when we are further into the implementation of the taxonomy, we're likely to be in a better position to consider the range of options that are available to us in implementing regulatory incentives.
Dr. Sulaiman, I'm sure that this is something that you would also like to join on. Oh, we can't. Are you on mute, unfortunately?
Very supportive of the initiatives, clearly, that's coming from the government as well as from the regulators. But the question is the clarity in terms of, you know, what does it mean, you know, to us to be able to communicate to customers? As it is, we are working with our customers in terms of wanting to do the transitioning, but the commercial viability angle, you know, how does it make sense basically for them to do transitioning? And yes, incentives is very important. When people get incentivized to move, and they will move. But I suppose, as DG mentioned, it's still prelim, you know, at this stage. I think carbon trading is something that's very interesting, and it's got a lot of clarity from the customer's perspective in terms of what is it to them, i.e. from an additional cost perspective, what emissions are they doing, and the mitigation they possibly can do. So I think if you have all those in place, clearly, I think it's something that, you know, a lot of business out there, you know, can really, and for us as well, for banks, in terms of the way that we do measurements, you know, there's a lot more clarity versus a lot of questionnaires. But I suppose the question is also important to create awareness. But information, as I've mentioned to you, is something that, you know, well, you know, all of us needs to work on even harder. I mean, this is not just a problem for Malaysia, presumably. I think it's for the region and it's for the world at large. But you got to begin somewhere, you know.
Absolutely. Dimitrious or John, would you like to weigh in on effective types of incentive that you've seen?
I mean, on my perspective, sorry, John, I just saw that you unmuted yourself as well. So, yeah. I mean, I'm not going to mention specific things that necessarily work because, I mean, things work differently in different markets, right? And needs, for example, in Asia might not necessarily be the same in Europe, for example. But there are some themes that tend to echo, right? We heard clarity, right? So that's something that's even on our side we value a lot, right? If there's going to be some kind of support measures or incentives and so on, those need to be clear, both in terms of the incentive, but also in terms of the capital treatment. For example, if we're looking specifically at financial institutions, right? In Europe, for example, there is a discussion whether, for example, climate risk will impact Pillar 1 requirements or Pillar 2 requirements. That needs to be clarified as well, right? And these are things that we hear even here in Asia, not only Southeast, but also North Asia, Hong Kong, China. They started asking the same type of question now, simply because there's no clarity from the regulators or for the government, right? So that's probably, I would say, my comment on this without going into the specifics. Yeah.
John, did you want to share?
I think it's been really well covered by my colleagues in terms of incentives from a regulatory point of view. Obviously, there's a lot of financial institutions that are ESG focused that have their own internal regulatory policy when it comes to decentivizing and incentivizing. But I'd just like to mention that, with CDP, we've been working with banks for financial climate stress testing in the UK and developing a repository of data within the UE for banks to pull together. And then, from our current analysis on internal carbon pricing, we believe corporates, what we can see is corporates in Asia, have the highest percentage of internal carbon pricing, and it's becoming, it's just becoming a real issue. So I think in the future we'd like to see the development of carbon markets. It's something that was talked about 10 years ago and this disappeared. But I think now it's going to come back, and research shows that corporate adoption of carbon pricing is rising, and this is going to be a good thing. I think what's the price now? It's European carbon pricing is about €87 a tonne at the start of 2022. Yeah.
Yes, perhaps if I can just offer a couple of observations. The European compliance market prices have gone through the roof. The voluntary market prices have moved up, but nothing remotely as high as that. But in many of the conversations I've had with companies and investors through the year, there's a question of how to bring finance directors of companies into the conversation. And sometimes if there's a price on carbon, it almost doesn't matter what the price is, $1, then they're going to see it. At the moment, they don't necessarily have visibility. So even if it's $1, then it becomes a line in their normal processes and they can start to think about it. So and the processes get put in place to start tracking it. So there's a benefit to carbon visibility at any price, even before prices which penalize high carbon behavior. And then if I may make the second observation from an investor perspective, Asia, particularly the less developed Asian countries that are primary producers and have low purchasing power parity, will be disadvantaged on portfolio decarbonization approaches applied at a global level. And so you can kind of call it a soft divestment. And I think that this, the investors that we do speak to do wonder about that. If there's an inadvertent pulling of capital from the companies and markets that actually need capital in order to transition, then that would be a mistake, essentially. So that is something that doesn't have a solution right now, but is something which is being focused on. Sorry, forgive me for taking that perspective. Let's go back to the audience questions. So, will lending rates be impacted by prospective borrowers' ESG grades? I think, shall we go with Dato Sulaiman first, seeing as you sat forward quickly?
Today is not clearly, but I'm very sure in the near term, it would be one, we would have, clear measurement in terms of the impact. I think that's just a matter of time. That will be a punitive measure, obviously. But then again, today I think the path is really about how do we mitigate it? How do we mitigate this? How do we work with our customers to make sure they do the transitioning? unless as such they don't want to do the transitioning. I think that's where the issue is. And today as it is, we've already got a list of negative factors that we don't want to be involved, and hence for new applications, if they involve in those businesses, clearly they are, is in a void list, clearly. But we've not gone yet to a differentiated pricing. It's something that is going to happen. I think it's not just us. I think industry as a whole. I think it's just a matter of time. But clearly, the issue here is a lot of education and awareness. And I think working with customers, working with them to mitigate, the exposure